RP is a growing company. We're going to actually start a subsidiary company called Tier 5 Nutrition. Do you want to be an investor?
Sure.
It's important to be tough in modern society. This
Correct.
coddling business, we're going to toughen you up by giving you stuff that's poisonous, or at the very least, makes your physical training more difficult because now it's less efficacious. That alone will get you mentally tougher.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say, start out your day with a 45-minute ice bath to build that toughness.
That's how I do it.
Exactly. Yeah. Hypothermia used to exist, but was largely overstated. So 45-minute ice bath straight into some tier 5 supplement that's just going to wreck your gut.
Yes.
And you will have no worse things happen to you that day.
The rest of the day is so great.
Yep.
That's what we're really giving you. Perspective. Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for RP Strength, and today we have an excellent, wonderful, amazing superstar guest, Dr. Eric Trexler. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'll start there.
Yeah.
Folks, Eric, I'm going to try to introduce you as best as I can with your credentials and qualifications, but you have so many, I'm going to miss a bunch, so please correct me. You are a former high school wrestler.
My top credential, yeah.
Yes, that's where I start.
Yeah.
And you have a PhD. You are a natural pro bodybuilder and actively currently involved in the research. You've helped design apps. And my God, you've kind of done it all. And so I have a bunch of questions for you. Some of them are directly in your expert area, and some are probably in areas you sort of casually became an expert in some time ago, but hopefully you still are interested in talking a little bit about them.
Sure, yeah.
All right. So, Satan worship, what does it mean to you? Okay. Metabolic adaptation, our first topic. What is your best definition in either technical or lay terms of metabolism?
To be totally honest, I know this is a cop-out, but it kind of depends on the context in which you're discussing it. When I talk about metabolism, when I'm staying in my domain of expertise to the extent that I have one, I'm talking about energy metabolism, right? So I would be talking about the total and subcomponents of energy expenditure in a given day. Now, of course, if you are talking to a pharmacologist, they're going to be talking about the breakdown and clearance of, molecules, metabolites, et cetera. So for me, I'm talking, the energy we're burning in total and in distinct components throughout the day.
To that end, and in that context, when people say and talk about metabolic adaptation, especially downregulation of the metabolism as seen during prolonged energy deficits, what is that? As people say metabolic adaptation, to me, I'm not that smart, so it confuses me. Can you explain to us what that is?
Yeah, the simplest explanation is that when you open your phone, if you want to, you can put it on low battery mode. And that really is metabolic adaptation. I'm really glad to hear that people don't use the term metabolic damage as much anymore. It was kind of in fashion for a while. Now we view it more as an adaptive or compensatory set of mechanisms. And the idea is basically it's usually discussed in terms of weight loss via dietary energy restriction. Mm-hmm. And the idea is when you are restricting your energy intake, you're initiating a diet, you're in an energy deficit, you're losing fat mass, we would expect that as you're losing weight successfully, your total daily energy expenditure should go down because you are going from a larger person to a smaller person with less metabolically active tissue to maintain.
Just on sheer physics.
Exactly.
No nuances required for that one.
Correct. But metabolic adaptation comes into play when you talk about this kind of extra compensatory reduction in energy expenditure that goes above and beyond what we would mathematically predict based on your changes in body mass. So it is this kind of energy conservation mode, which of course it's not an on-off switch. It's kind of a gradient or a dimmer switch. But as the energy deficit and fat loss gets more exaggerated, more pronounced, we see the body basically initiating a number of compensatory changes and adjustments to try to conserve energy as much as possible. Nowadays, I spend about half my time in an evolutionary anthropology department, and we're interested in looking at energy expenditure through the lens of evolutionary adaptations. and evolutionary advantages, basically. So it would make all the sense in the world that, organisms, especially humans, we only have a few really non-negotiable priorities from a biological perspective.
Video games.
Yeah. You know the
Netflix
hits.
series you must watch.
Exactly. But when it comes to like, what are we just absolutely innately made to do? What must we do? You got to have energy. You got to have ATP. You got to have water. You got to have oxygen, right? Those are the key ones. So it would make sense that if you are, for whatever reason, experiencing a shortfall of energy intake, your body can at least slow down the process of functionally starving to death, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
As far as effector variables that cause metabolic adaptation, not mechanisms, because that'll be my next question.
Yeah.
If you want to combine those answers, totally, by all means. What types of effector variables cause metabolic adaptation? Some of my candidates just heuristically in my head would be like the magnitude of the deficit, the duration of the deficit. Maybe if we go into probably not true land, like specific types of foods or maybe stress levels or sleep, etc. What have you seen in the literature in your own experience and your own kind of elevating just above the primary literature to inference that are really the main variables that like you do this like this, it's going to cause the metabolism to downregulate? Yeah.
I actually am going to answer that with the mechanism kind of all in one, because I think it's the most sensible way to do it. So usually with physiological systems, it can be really hard to boil things down to one simple mechanism. The body's complicated. There's a lot going on. But when it comes to metabolic adaptation, it is oddly like fairly straightforward in terms of mechanisms. We have a hormone called leptin, which is actually, if you're into like the nerdy science stuff, most of the stuff we talk about in science was discovered like 200 years ago or like 100 years ago. Leptin came around in the 90s. Like it's like
trip.
Yeah, it's like pretty new. So, and that's not our ability to kind of create synthetic or recombinant leptin. That's just us knowing what it is in the human body in the 1990s.
What the hell is that?
Which is really crazy. But leptin is this hormone. It's produced predominantly by fat cells, especially when they're full of energy. And that leptin circulates throughout the body, makes it to the hypothalamus in the brain. And its main job is to give the brain basically a running update of how we're doing in terms of energy. And the hypothalamus is a critically important brain structure. It coordinates so many different responses in the body. So the hypothalamus kind of gets this message and then has all this downstream coordination of what we're going to do about our kind of constant update of energy status. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about things that impact the degree or magnitude of metabolic adaptation, we really are talking about things that impact leptin, right? So without question, the severity of an energy deficit is going to have an impact on leptin. By
severity, sorry, just for clarity,
sure.
by severity, you mean the amount of energy deficit. So like someone typically burns 2,500 calories just for maintenance. You slice them down to 2,200 calories. There's going to be some kind of leptin activity change. But if you slice them down to 1,800, there's going to be significantly more.
Yeah.
Real quick, just as an aside, and I'm not sure if the literature has elucidated this, is the mechanism seemingly quite linear, or is it one of those exponentials that the deeper you cut, the worse it gets?
Well, that's kind of difficult to answer because, well, it's certainly leptin's effects in the body are definitely not linear in the general sense. And the reason being, back in the 90s when they discovered leptin, they said, oh my God, this is crazy. If we give you leptin, then we can tell your hypothalamus you've got all the energy you need. Therefore,
what a hopeful time.
Yeah, this will be the best thing ever. It'll literally single-handedly stop obesity, reverse obesity. Like we did it. We're done, right? But it turns out that high leptin levels don't have near the impact that low leptin levels do physiologically.
Interesting.
Yeah, because if you take the blood of someone with really elevated adiposity, very high body fat percentage, they are likely to have extremely high leptin levels. And so you'd think, well, what gives? Like the hypothalamus should be getting that. It should be understanding, like, shut down appetite, ramp up expenditure, like we're good. But unfortunately, just like with insulin, we can become leptin resistant. And so leptin's relationship to its receptor gets kind of desensitized. And so you've got all this leptin floating around, and your hypothalamus, the receptors there get so, in layman's terms, used to it that they kind of ignore that signal. So definitely leptin's effects are not linear, but when it comes to, the drivers of metabolic adaptation, we can induce an acute response in leptin by giving someone a huge energy deficit, a really large reduction in calories relative to their expenditure.
What sort of, heuristically, just like, give us, what's a large reduction percent-wise from maintenance? What would you, because is it 5% large? Is it 25%? Whereabouts would you say, like, okay, this is business, now we're rolling?
In terms of the deficit?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really funny because the answer in the fitness world is so different from the answer in the research world.
Sure.
You go to the medical literature on, in the fitness industry, you got people who are going, should I cut on 2,300 calories or 22? And they're like agonizing over it. You go to the medical literature and they're like, 600. Guess what? Here's your 800 calorie a day diet.
Yeah.
Do it for 12 weeks. We're not going to change a thing.
Yes.
Like you have 2 of these little tiny beverages a day and that's it. Right. Yeah. So deficits, I would say in the fitness world, 250 calories a day would be like a pretty modest, but you're still doing something, right? Yeah. 500 calories a day is a fairly typical, okay, we're really in a groove here dieting and we're inducing some weight loss. When you start getting above 500 calories per day, that's when you start getting into like, okay, we've got a pretty big deficit here. Mm-hmm. And then up to 1,000, people really have a rough time going 1,000 calories a day and above.
Is that on absolute levels for everyone, or is that scaled to your maintenance calories and body weight? Because like if I weigh 800 pounds and I'm living on 12,000 calories a day, is it true that 1,000 calorie deficit for me, I could just smoke a cig right through that and not even notice? But for someone who has a 1,500 calorie intake, 1,000 is like going to ruin your life for forever? Yeah.
So based on the physiology, it probably should scale with, body weight, energy expenditure, things like that. So it probably should be framed more as a percent rather than a flat number of calories. Sure. But what you tend to find, you can work backwards with the math and say, if I want to lose this many pounds per week, how large does my deficit have to be? And you kind of work from there. What you tend to find is just in a totally practical sense, when you start putting people on deficits that are over 1,000 calories per day, they start to look down at their plate and say, where'd all the food go? Mm-hmm. And they start to really, not even from a physiological sense necessarily, but from a practical sense, it can become really difficult to induce a deficit that's substantially greater than that, right? So let's say, you're burning 2,500 calories per day, which is like a fairly typical, energy expenditure. Now, all of a sudden, we're talking about going from a very comfortable maintenance diet to eating 1,500 calories a day, which is a dramatic, especially if you're trying to get plenty of protein in your diet, plenty of fiber. You really don't have a lot of wiggle room left for the stuff that we like to eat, starches, sugars, fats, etc. Yeah. So usually the reason that I like to give it in flat numbers is because you can convert those flat numbers straight to like a pounds per week kind of thing mathematically.
Versus percentages, you got to do another layer of calculating. Like, I don't even know.
Yeah. And, we have pretty good meta-regression evidence looking at the magnitude of deficit and the likelihood of actually building or maintaining fat-free mass. That evidence is presented in calories per day, and it gives us a pretty decent heuristic. One of the reasons that I like generally aiming for about 500 calories per day is because you'll get where you're trying to go. You can do the math backwards and figure out how many pounds per week you're losing, things like that. You're making progress towards your goal. But also, the evidence so far would suggest when you start getting well above 500 calories per day in terms of the size of your energy deficit, much higher likelihood that you're going to be losing more fat-free mass as the diet progresses.
And also, at least from my experience, and some of the literature might confirm this, your experience of the thing dramatically falls off a cliff when you get into higher deficits. It's easy to run the numbers on a napkin and be like, fuck it, I'll just do 1,000 calorie deficit for 18 weeks. But one does not simply do that.
Yeah.
It turns out that it feels a level of misery that's kind of an order of magnitude higher than 500. And you're like, okay, this didn't work out.
Yeah. So when you're choosing a size of an energy deficit for a diet, there's so many factors that go into it. Some of them are physiological, some of them are very practical, right? And kind of impacting the subjective experience of how this is going to go. So yeah, you have to kind of tread lightly. I mean, there's so many studies in the medical literature where they say, okay, you have a lot of fat to lose. We want to get there very quickly. Therefore, we're going to give you 800 calories a day. But we also see in the medical literature this very bleak picture of what does it look like after that's over. And it's really not good. It's really not pretty. The rates of weight regain are extremely high. And sometimes it can be such a negative subjective experience that people regain more weight than they lost, you know?
And maybe even as bad or worse. And please feel free. By the way, for the record, if I say anything that's wrong, just straight up tell me, like, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
A lot of people, not everyone, from such a disastrous experience tend to write off fat loss dieting and sometimes fitness writ large as something that's just not fitting their vibe. Like, this isn't something I'm going to be doing again. And that's kind of terrible, because if you had a 400 calorie deficit for that person, after, multiple months of dieting, they'd look different, they'd feel different, and they'd be like, I can do this again after a maintenance phase.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because there's this like fine balance that needs to be reached, right? If you look at the goal setting literature, it's pretty clear. When you set a goal, it needs to be ambitious enough to get you excited, and you have to progress in a way that actually provides some reinforcement where you feel like you're doing the thing.
Yes.
But at the same time, if you go too ambitious, you're setting yourself up for failure, or you'll make the experience just dreadful. And you'll say, the reality of getting there is so much worse. It's not even worth it to actually get there in the end, right?
Yes.
So yeah, you really do have to shoot for the middle. And I've actually seen instances where, man, health behavior psychology is fascinating. There's a study that I reviewed in the Mass Research Review a couple years ago.
Great publication, by the way. I'm a subscriber. Everyone listening has to get on it.
Thank you. But yeah, it was they had this great idea, and they said, we're going to do this intervention where we start out with the dieting part, and then they'll get some success going with the diet, and then about 6 months into the intervention, we're then going to introduce the exercise component. It actually backfired. You would think intuitively, okay, you get some success going, you get the ball rolling, now you add the next layer, the success kind of feeds into that motivation. What they found was people started with the dieting, got to the middle and said, this already is hard and sucks.
Ooh.
And so then you say, well, guess what? Now we're going to do the hard part. We're going to introduce the next phase.
Ooh.
And so what they found actually was it was better to introduce both at the beginning than to kind of do it in that like graded fashion. But of course, if they threw way too much at them in the beginning, it would have been a disaster. So it kind of highlights that fine balance to strike between, okay, let's dive into the hard part now, when theoretically motivation at the beginning of an intervention is going to be about as high as it's going to get, right? So leverage that high motivation and try to avoid massive changes midway through, right? So I would argue the best option would be, if we know that an intervention is going to be exercise plus diet, let's start both of them at the beginning with enough kind of, dosage, so to speak, to...
I'm familiar with dosage.
Yeah, to get things rolling. And the changes we make from there are incremental, right?
Yes.
So we start out with enough ambition in terms of how we're setting the diet and exercise to make serious progress. And we know we're going to have to make changes, but we don't want to get to the point where someone is like, okay, I'm already kind of struggling with this. And we say, well, guess what? Now it's phase 2 and we're really going, because that can be really deflating.
Yeah. Holy crap. This is terrible. Scott, this is a terrible idea to have Eric out here, because I just want to ask him 15 follow-up questions, and every single one of his sub-answers to a sub-question of the sub-interview. So as far as primary mechanisms, you're saying leptin, if not explanatory on the grand scale, is like kind of the mTOR of this thing. It really is kind of the central governor of metabolic adaptation.
Yeah.
But it's, as also you would sort of predict from evolutionary logic, if you overeat a bunch, leptin's like, whatever, keep it up, you're doing great. But if you undereat, leptin's like, whoa, we're going to die.
Yeah.
That's kind of your take on that sort of situation?
Exactly. Yeah. And, you had asked about, linearity when it comes to this effect. And I think the best way to describe how leptin is kind of doing its thing and where there are some thresholds where things start to get really rough.
Okay.
It's not as clear in terms of the daily deficit, but the deficit is one element that can, if we just take somebody in and just have them fast for a day, we can immediately see a massive change in leptin, right? Like we can just induce it like that. But one of the really big picture regulators of leptin is going to be the actual amount of fat mass that you have, right? So while the deficit is a contributor, I would say the biggest contributor when it comes to like what's really driving this massive sustained change in leptin, it's fat tissue, right? And John Speakman has written some great papers about what's called the dual intervention point model of body weight regulation. Back in the day, Mike, I'm sure you remember, everybody talked about, the body fat set point theory,
yes.
right? And if you read it based on the way it's actually written in the literature, almost no one still gets on board with that.
Yeah.
Because like it basically, the way it's like literally written leaves almost no room for like behavior, environment, like all these things that clearly matter. Yeah. And it's difficult to explain why in a population like America, well, why would it be so consistently drifting upwards, right? Like if it's set, like, well then, okay, like let's do the thing that sets it and prevents that kind of consistent increase. So then people move to the settling point theory, which again, if you read the way it's actually written in the research, not the way it got kind of popularized in fitness, still kind of nobody gets on board with that because it leaves almost no room for this kind of physiological feedback system, this regulation that occurs. So the dual intervention point model, in my opinion, is the best of both worlds. And it basically suggests that we have a range. Each individual person has a range of body fat levels where they feel really comfortable. And if it starts getting too low, that those physiological feedback mechanisms kick in big time. If body fat gets too high, those feedback systems do kick in big time.
Because maybe less big time?
Maybe less big time, and probably varies from person to person. Okay. But like, for example, when I was in college, I decided that I wanted to get as big as possible, as fast as possible. I ate everything in the world that I could.
Me too.
And like a lot of folks who have tried to do that will tell you, like, once you reach a certain point, it is extremely difficult to continue gaining weight.
You look at food and you're like, why do people do this to themselves?
Yeah, you really start to get like kind of disgusted and you feel terrible.
Oh yeah.
Like it really bad. There was a time, you mentioned my wrestling career, where I was like a sophomore and our lineup was loaded with seniors. So I had to wrestle up like 2 or 3 weight classes.
Oh my God.
I was like certified to wrestle at 135 and ended up wrestling at 160 that year, which meant that they wouldn't even let me go on the mat unless I weighed in at 152.1.
For your own safety.
For my own safety, yeah. And so while everyone was on the bus to these meets, dehydrated, starving to death, just miserable, I promise you, because I've been there, I was just as miserable in the opposite direction. I was like a balloon full of just like food and water. I felt
really
terrible.
Fun to wrestle bloated.
No.
I'd much rather wrestle depleted than bloated, to be honest.
Yeah. Because at least like, especially at a tournament, if you're depleted at 6 a.m., you weigh in. By the time you get to the championship round, it's 6 p.m. You feel great, or you feel greater, Yeah. But anyway, so dual intervention point model leaves a lot of room in the middle for the stuff we always do. Like, when we decide, I'm going to gain some weight, I'm going to lose some weight, we have some room to work before we run into like really massive barriers of physiological regulation. Yeah. And you ask, like, is there a place where this really starts to take off and get terrible? Mm-hmm. I would say more so than any number in terms of your daily deficit, the place where it really starts to get terrible is when you reach your lower intervention point and you say, I'm going to keep pushing anyway. And you try to get leaner than that kind of leanest level that your body's comfortable with.
This may be a stretch because I don't know if anything in the formal literature covers it, but you're not only here to talk about formal literature because you have just oodles of experience. So please feel free to lean in on that.
Sure.
Is there a situation you see in which there is a long-term, at least on the margins, re-architecting of your body's settling range to where like if you used to be about 15% fat for a long time, but with lifestyle interventions and just getting at it for 4 or 5 diets with maintenance phases in between, clear some diet fatigue. And now you're living your best life at 11% body fat. Before, when you got to 11% from 15, let's say on your first run of a deficit, you were like not having a good time at that point anymore. And you were looking at like food like it was magic. Is there a point where like if you're living your life at 13%, then at 12, and then finally at 11, is there a point at which at 11, maybe you don't feel exactly as balanced as you did at 15, but significantly more than you did the first time you got to 11? Or is it one of these things like, is just straight up on the numbers? You're going to feel a certain way at 11 always when you get there.
Yeah, I would have to lean on more anecdote and experience for that. Cause yeah, I'm just not sure of literature that I can really lean on. I would say, you know, anecdotally, certainly people report subjectively like, hey, it's not so bad this time around.
Yeah.
But I do wonder how much of that is physiology and how much is psychology, right? So it's pretty impactful to go to a place you've been before and not have the worries, the concerns, there is something yeah. Like, I mean, I remember the first time I did a bodybuilding competition and actually got in like really good shape, right? Like first competition did great for like the novice category, sure, right? But not anything, you know, where you'd say, wow, that person looks ill, right? That's when you know you've kind of gotten there. Is like the second time I competed, you know, people were like, wow, Eric looks very sick.
And people look at your face and they're like, is everything okay at home? You're like, no, it's not. I don't get any food.
Right. Yeah. Help. Yeah. I mean, I remember, you know, I heard through the grapevine that there were like people in the administrative office were like asking around.
Get out of here.
Yeah. Like, is Eric actually okay?
That's how you know you're going to win some shit.
Yeah. Yeah. That was when I was prepping for my pro card and pro debut.
And you got the pro card.
I did.
Hell
yeah. There was a really, really lovely woman who worked up in the office who had asked around and been like, is Eric going to like make it? Like, is he going to pull through? And they're like, oh yeah, he's an athlete. That's
doing this to himself, believe it or not.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the second time I got that lean, just from knowing, okay, this is going to be weird. It's not going to feel great. It's going to suck. The physiology is going to be strange. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, people always talk about hunger, but the things that really get to you are, I can't sleep at night. Yeah. Like that to me is the worst.
Oh yeah.
And then just the weirdness. Like, how come I don't have to trim my fingernails as frequently as I used to? Like, that's so strange.
On my last diet.
Yeah, it's really weird. But like the first time you go through, it's almost like this state of panic. Like everything's weird.
Trepidation.
Yeah, yeah.
What's going to happen tomorrow?
Exactly. And you know, I think a big source of that is the big question that hangs over a lot of people. This is going to end, right? Like, what does the process feel like of going back to normal?
Yeah.
And I feel like once you've been there and then back to normal once, you say, oh, okay, yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is psychology. Part of it is the fact that I think for some individuals, I'm quite certain that the distance between the lower and upper intervention point is just wider than for others. And so I think some people really have a tendency to drift way up toward, way farther from their lower intervention point. And the process of making that huge dive at first can be very, very daunting.
Yes.
So, you know, is there something going on with leptin receptor sensitivity that is causing some degree of maybe modest adjustment of that window? Perhaps. But I would definitely say that anecdotally, if we're looking at it from a practical perspective, you know, whether it is psychology, whether it is physiology, sometimes it kind of doesn't matter. Like I can tell you that people, once they've been down there, it does seem to become a more tolerable and more successful experience in subsequent attempts.
Yeah.
And whether we attribute that to psychology or physiology through mechanisms we don't understand yet, I'm not sure I necessarily care from a practical perspective.
Totally.
You know?
On average, and let's talk about in the context of a typical 8 to 12 week, fuck this, I'm getting in shape diet. Not a show diet, nothing crazy, no metabolic ward, 400 calories a day, and then they lock the door and turn off the lights and you're shivering in the corner. That's how I understand most of the research is conducted. How large is the effect on average of metabolic adaptation? Because you get, depending on who you talk to, And it can be something like, oh, it's like 150 calories, or some people think it's 1,000 calories.
Yeah.
And if, because you are very, very good at answering multiple questions at the same time, and then questions I didn't even have, which is wonderful. Maybe at the same time if you'd like, or I'll just come back to it if you don't. What kind of variance do we see among individuals? So give us like a mean and standard deviation. You don't have to cite research and give us exact numbers unless you'd like, but just vibe check wise.
Sure. Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought up the disparity, where some people say, oh, it's like 50 calories, or some people say it's an illusion, it doesn't exist at all. And then other people will say, oh yeah, it's like 1,000 calories, right?
You're going to die.
Yeah. There is actually like a really straightforward explanation for the confusion there. If you look at the literature on metabolic adaptation, there are really two camps, two schools of thought. Some people in the literature quantify metabolic adaptation just by looking at the the adaptive reduction in resting metabolic rate.
Mm-hmm.
And that usually is only like 100 or 150 calories. And then when you take someone from an active dieting phase and you just have them maintain for like 4 weeks, that'll shrink from like 100, 150 down to like sometimes 50, right? And so
barely detectable.
So you'll see people saying this is like physiologically not worth caring about. But that is a huge mistake, because, well, it's not a mistake. I understand why the researchers are doing it and they don't misunderstand it, but the messaging gets out to people and it gets really misinterpreted. Resting metabolic rate makes up maybe 10 or 15% of the total magnitude of metabolic adaptation. Most of that reduction is happening in non-exercise activity thermogenesis. We're talking like 80, 85% of it, maybe even 90. And that's usually what's not getting measured in those studies.
Right.
And there's a good reason. It's very hard to measure that.
Oh my God.
Because you almost have to measure it by crossing everything else out. Like if you really wanted to know non-exercise activity thermogenesis, you'd have to directly measure the calories spent during intentional exercise, at rest, during sleep, after meals, like, and then it would still just be whatever you didn't get.
Yes.
You know, it'd be total energy expenditure minus all the things you measured.
That would be a metabolic ward study. They can't
yeah.
do that anywhere else, basically.
And even like, you know, we've got some colleagues who do really great work down at Pennington in Louisiana, where they bring in people and they're doing doubly labeled water. They're having them in the, the overnight metabolic chambers. And it's still really difficult to get a solid estimate of non-exercise activity thermogenesis. But to answer your question directly, when we're looking at total daily energy expenditure, what's the adaptive reduction? I think when you're looking at studies where people are losing a good like 10% of body mass, 10 to 15% of body mass.
In what time frame?
Usually for non-fitness folks, those studies usually tend to be, I think probably in the 20 to 24 week range most of the time.
That's a long diet.
Yeah. So, some of them are as short as 12 to 16, but those are the ones where they're going to be like, hey, here's your 800 calorie shakes for the duration. Have fun. But, you know, generally speaking, the best estimates that we get of like a substantial weight loss, like a 10% of body weight, which is like if you weighed 180 and you wanted to cut down for the summer and you lose 18 pounds, boom, there's your 10%, right?
18's a lot for someone who weighs 180. It's a different person in pictures and visually.
Yeah. But it is a fairly common, like, I'm going to do like a substantial cut, boom, 10% of body mass, right? Yep. So for that, we usually see an adaptive drop in energy expenditure of about...
Total energy expenditure. If you're going by percentage, it's often around 25% of total daily energy expenditure. So you basically are burning about 3/4 of the calories we thought you would on a day-to-day basis. Thought you would, accounting for the body mass difference.
Correct.
The body mass difference isn't considered metabolic adaptation in the...
Correct.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Even though it, in a certain technical way, is if you expand your horizons a bit.
Yeah. And if I can give you the calorie number, usually what they'll... And because this is where it's a little bit easier to give some standard deviations that I can kind of recall. A lot of times that ends up looking like a 300 to 400 calorie adaptive magnitude. So people are burning, 300 or 400 calories less than we thought they would based on their body composition characteristics after this diet. And the standard deviation is usually about the same size as the mean.
Oh,
so it's
my
usually
God.
like 300 to 400 plus or minus 300 to 400.
So some people, luck of the draw, are like experiencing, well, actually, say a good fraction of people won't experience any metabolic adaptation.
Yeah, assuming a normal distribution.
Totally, right. Well, yes, anything like a normal distribution.
Yeah.
Do you think it's roughly normally distributed, as most complex biological traits tend to be?
I wouldn't be surprised if it was a little bit kurtotic,
Okay.
which I'm sure, everyone talks about kurtosis all the time in the fitness world.
It's my favorite thing to talk about.
I would think that it's probably close enough to normal. But I do think there's probably a lot of clustering around that mean value with some outliers.
So it's just super quick to folks listening. What Eric is saying here is that as a normal distribution means that, like, if one standard deviation above and below, you're catching like 2/3 of all people.
Yeah.
But if it's a distribution like we see here, it's actually going to catch there's a huge spike much higher than you would expect. So maybe a little bit higher than you would expect. So it's not like there's tons of people who just don't develop a metabolic adaptation at all. Fewer than you would expect from a truly normally distributed population.
Yeah, and I could be wrong about that. Maybe it is normal. I'd have to track down some friends and say, hey, let me look at your data.
That's right.
But either way, like I would say anecdotally, my experience, the reason that I tend to think that there's probably some more clustering around the mean with some bigger outliers is just because, anecdotally, you do see it more often than not in some magnitude. Most people tend to be, okay, I've got some metabolic adaptation, but not an egregious amount. And then every now and then you do see those examples of people who are like, Iron Culture podcast, we were interviewing someone who was like, a world champion. And they're like, yeah, I just diet and then all the fat goes away and I usually feel pretty good. And
Son of a bitch.
Yeah. And they're like dieting on, my off season calories. And I'm just like, how does this work? Right. But then you've also got the people who things really grind, they really slow down and they
That's
have to.
a real thing we have to recognize. We can't just be like, oh man, you need more willpower, bro. Like some people really do have it harder on a diet.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can go into the research on like metabolic phenotyping, right?
Yeah.
So there are people that they categorize as having a thrifty or a spendthrift metabolic phenotype. And I think this gets into that significant amount of variation, where there are going to be some of these folks who they're very spendthrift, meaning they don't really experience a ton of metabolic adaptation on the way down. So you might look at them and say, oh, you're so lucky, you can diet down without a lot of friction. But the friction they run into when bulking is pretty substantial. Like they really struggle to induce substantial caloric surplus.
So in your view, based on literature and personal experience, people that have metabolisms that are very adaptive, in the sense that when they try to lose weight, shit doesn't go well because the metabolism adjusts a ton, are typically adaptive concomitantly in the opposite direction as well? Or is there like a shit genetics you can get that, like, when I try to lose weight, my body cuts my expenditure by 500 calories. But when I try to gain weight, it's like, hey, buddy, here's a massive appetite and keep going.
It usually looks like people, based on this metabolic phenotyping concept, which, is people usually look at it in research in the acute sense more than like longer term interventions. But it would seem to suggest that usually you get lucky with at least one side of the coin, right? So like if we're looking at life through the lens of a bodybuilder, which I'm sure we both do,
sure,
you'd say, well, I'd like to be able to gain a bunch of muscle when I want to and also lose a bunch of fat when I want to. Well, the folks who experience a lot of friction on the way down, they have a lot of metabolic adaptation when they try to lose weight, they actually can kind of gain weight fairly readily. Now, if you're not lifting and trying to gain a bunch of muscle, that might not be ideal. But, it also makes you unlikely to be the person who's like, I would do anything to gain 10 pounds and I just can't, right?
Okay.
But on the other hand, the folks who experience really minimal adaptation on the way down, when they try to intentionally overfeed, they seem to have really robust increases in energy expenditure and reductions in appetite. So it's the people who can cut easiest who usually struggle to bulk. And the people who can bulk the easiest usually struggle more to cut.
Man, that is some wise shit. I love that. As far as external variables, that weigh in on the size of the variance. Can we manipulate some variables and make that metabolic adaptation larger or smaller? And to that effect, maybe how big of a role does the size of your deficit play? How big of a role does dietary duration play? Or is it all just raw, like how much fat has been drained out of your fat cells and how much are they screaming at you?
Yeah, I think it's really tough to say because the single biggest predictor here is going to be the cumulative energy deficit, right? So that manifests as the degree of fat lost. And especially, I would say it starts to get particularly tough when you're not just talking about, yeah, I've lost a bunch of weight, but now I am clearly something different happens. You kick into another gear once you start to get down to body fat levels that are like, we're really threatening survival here if a famine comes, right? And because that's ultimately what has calibrated and titrated our physiological feedback mechanisms through our evolutionary history.
We did not evolve to bodybuild, unfortunately.
Right, we didn't.
Tragedy of human existence.
Yeah, and to be totally honest, from a physiological regulation perspective, your body probably doesn't care that much if, as a male, just to kind of set the ranges, if your body fat's 21% or 18%. It's basically the same thing, right? In terms of your suitability for surviving the next famine, your ability to be mobile enough to avoid predation, because that is currently the theory of what sets the upper intervention point for most people is at a certain point, you don't want to get so lean that you're very
near death,
prone to starvation, right? If the famine comes around. But you also don't want to gain so much weight that it's hard to get around for hunting, for foraging, for avoiding predators.
That last one's gnarly.
Yeah. So all of that is to say, like, I used to, when I first got into studying metabolic adaptation, I got into it because I was a bodybuilder. I dieted. Things got weird. I didn't like it. I said, I want to fix that, and I want to do it in a way that's really actionable and sustainable. And here's a diet or training intervention that will really significantly attenuate or mitigate this effect. And at first I thought, okay, we've got these great tools. We're going to do refeeds. We're going to do diet breaks. We're going to, really closely modify the energy deficit. The more, and I've been really fortunate to team up with a lot of really smart folks to do some research in these areas. And so far, I'd say the results have been really underwhelming for someone who wanted to fix this. It doesn't make me happy to say that, but at the end of the day, like, that's what you sign up for when you're doing studies, is like, we're going to try to do it. And if it fails, then we write up a paper literally talking about how we're dumb and failures, right? Like, this didn't go the way we thought, right? So, the refeed research so far is a little bit underwhelming for trying to really put a dent in metabolic adaptation. The diet break research is also kind of underwhelming. It does seem like the cumulative energy deficit really kind of wins out. So I think over a given time frame, you could say, okay, well, if we want to kind of take this nice and easy, we're probably setting ourselves up for success on multiple levels, right? Like, okay, if we are keeping a more modest deficit, perhaps we may in fact, it's not really about mitigating or attenuating the effect. It's just not like stepping on a rake and making this way worse than it has to be, right? So I wouldn't be shocked if research will eventually show us that going with a really aggressive deficit just makes it unnecessarily more extreme in the early phases of dieting, right? Like, you're just jumping into that metabolic adaptation a little earlier than you needed to.
Because then it's with you and it makes the rest of the shit suck.
Right. But I do think that, if we're talking about doing anything resembling a bodybuilding type diet or getting, what a lot of fitness enthusiasts would call shredded.
Yes.
I think
it's hashtag shredded.
Hashtag shredded. My mistake.
It's okay.
I think at the end of the day, that energy deficit, that low body fat impact, that's going to catch up to you eventually. And so what I usually encourage people to do, and we're still doing research on this stuff. We're still looking into refeeds, diet breaks, concepts like reverse dieting. We got a study that we're doing right now on that. And I haven't given up hope because there are some very legitimate critiques to the work we've done up to this point that we need to rectify. But for now, I usually, when I'm talking to people about metabolic adaptation, I say the goal here isn't to avoid, it's not to mitigate, it's not to attenuate. The goal is, let's not step on the rake and make this worse than it has to, no need to make unforced errors here. Let's try to go as smoothly as we can here. Let's not engage with the metabolic adaptation until we're actually lean enough for it to be pertinent, which is why I say maybe not like a super aggressive crash diet. And most importantly, let's just know it exists. Because I think for a lot of people, again, getting into the psychology of it, that's the worst part, is when you say, okay, I thought I was going to need a diet at 2,300 calories. Right now I'm at 1,950 and I'm still not losing weight at the clip I hoped for. Are we screwed? Like, is this just not going to work, or what's the deal? We talked about the magnitude of metabolic adaptation. We talked about a fairly substantial amount of variance in that. Some of that is inevitably going to be measurement error. Some of that is going to be true variability person to person. But, I think when we're talking about that variation, it's important to help people realize, like, hey, you could be someone who experiences more metabolic adaptation than others, but there are caps, there are limits. No one is just adapting to the point that it's like, well, even if you try to starve to death, it's just not going to happen.
He's you can't get there. 3 years, like, he's not dying.
He's not even losing weight.
I mean, he's gaining weight now.
Yeah, so like that's one of the myths that really kind of, I'm normally pretty even keeled, but I do want to like smash my head against the wall when I hear people say like, well, you're not losing weight because you're eating too little. Like, that's never happened. Ever, right?
It's painful to see that as people educated in the field.
And along those lines, like, even if you're someone who is kind of more of an outlier toward a very high level of metabolic adaptation while dieting, there is still a number for you where we can get that weight loss moving in the right direction. And there is a cap to this. You cannot just adapt to the point where you just have no energy expenditure. Yes. Where it really comes down to, though, for those people, and it usually is where you start to run into difficult conversations, is people that are trying to get shredded and they have very small stature and they're very lean, and you're saying like, okay, we can still find a number for you in terms of calories per day that's going to get you on the track you want to get on for weight loss.
Shred City, that's where that train goes.
Exactly. But because you're so small and your energy expenditure is so low, we are getting into weird numbers that make a lot of people uncomfortable.
Less than 1,000 type of numbers.
We're getting into those numbers where a good practitioner takes a double look at their spreadsheet and says, I'm not sure if I feel comfortable telling a person to eat this amount of food.
Yeah.
Right? And I have been there with clients before where I've said, we can make this work, but there's a difference between what we can do and what we should do.
And
right?
How much fun you're going to have.
Exactly. And so the smaller you are, to kind of like round out that point, you start making really hard decisions about like, how are we going to get the nutrients we need to be a healthy person and induce the rate of weight loss that you want to induce?
Yes.
Usually we have to basically meet in the middle and say, that competition plan to compete in 8 weeks, what if we make it 16? And then we can get there.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So have everyone goes through a certain amount of metabolic adaptation. Some much more, some much less, most people somewhere in the middle. Are there any dependable signals from a person's, I don't have scientific instruments around, perspective that are telling me, yeah, it's not just some water weight stuff. It's not just measurement error. It's not that you had some salt for higher for a few weeks or the humidity changed. Metabolic adaptation is really starting to show itself. For example, like, does something happen with hunger levels, energy levels, sleep? I have a couple of things that we say at RP. One of them is, as soon as your sleep dependably goes, unless, even if you're competitive with bodybuilding, I would say, like, you don't trade off your sleep for anything. You're not going to win any shows when your sleep goes sufficiently to hell.
Yeah.
But especially if you're just dieting to get shredded for the summer, whatever deficit you're running, as soon as you dependably, reliably, multiple days in a row, clear, the not sleep from like your stomach's rumbling and telling you suck and it's 2 a.m. As soon as that goes, you probably need to reconsider the magnitude of the deficit and reconsider your timelines. Is that sensible? And do you have any other like hunger, energy level kind of things that aren't telling us anything scientifically super factful, but kind of like maybe hinting us in the direction of like, you're getting some adaptation now, and you have to make a difficult choice of, do I back off the pedal and take a bit of a diet break, or do I smash the pedal and keep going?
Yeah, I think it helps to kind of go back to the source, right? We talked about how leptin actually is this kind of shockingly one-size-fits-all mechanism to explain what's going on. And you start thinking, okay, well, if my leptin is super low right now and I'm likely to be experiencing a lot of these adaptations, what would I expect to see with that? And so, for example, leptin controls the hormone cascades related to sex hormones and related to thyroid hormone. So I know for me, when I'm really deep in a diet and I'm like, okay, we've tapped into that next gear where metabolic adaptation is really setting in. Of course, you can look at your calories and weight trend and say, okay, that looks weird. That a bit of a mismatch there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes what I'll do to double check that, though, I remember one time I was prepping. This was back, Mike, you remember this. Everyone in natural bodybuilding was doing a ton of HIIT, high intensity interval training.
It's just what smart people did.
Everyone was doing a ton of it. And on top of their normal resistance training. And I was prepping for a show, and I made a weight, a calorie reduction, and I expected to see a certain amount of weight loss, and it was not happening. And it was like going on and on and on. And I was like, I know I changed my diet, and my body responded 0% to that change.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. So I took a few days off, no cardio, no weight training, slept more, and just immediately shed this water weight, and it was so clear, like
fatigue-based water weight.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you were just pushing way too hard with the high intensity interval training, the weight training, all that stuff. You're probably stressed out because you see the date on the calendar and you're like, I'm already behind and I'm not getting closer, right? So sometimes it is good to double check that by just kind of saying, let's take our foot off the pedal and see if we just kind of shed some water weight. But outside of that, when you start to notice libido taking a hit, when you start to notice that you're freezing cold all the time because you have like no thyroid hormone, right. That's usually a good indicator. Like when I was prepping for my pro card, I was working in North Carolina, and I had to walk up this giant hill to work, and it was July in North Carolina, long uphill walk, and I was wearing 2 sweatshirts because I was freezing. And I was like, yeah, this is different, man. Like, this is weird.
I would go and train, do my work, come home, and watch Batman cartoons on my laptop underneath 3 blankets.
Yeah. Did you ever prep? You lived in Vegas for a while, right?
Yes.
Was it the type of thing where you just looked around and everyone was dying and you're like, oh, this is great?
I feel great at this. This is great. 100 degrees. It matches my vibe. Yeah, Jared Feather, IFB Pro, he loves Thailand for a few reasons, but Scott's back there laughing. A few tens of millions of reasons, I guess. But, when he's in prep mode, Bangkok seems like the perfect temperature for everything.
Yeah. It's probably like a steam room.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and oh my God. Yeah, you get off the plane, you're like, this is a mistake. I got to get back on. Okay, so what about a perception of lethargy? Do you think that can hint at the fact that you're getting into some metabolic stuff?
It could, but perception's tough, man. Like, perception is one of those things like, when you're hanging out with a bunch of, 40-something power lifters that have been beating the crap out of their body for the last 3 decades, your joints hurt more because every time someone gets up, they, do the grunt, So there are some of these kind of like social influences and psychological influences that make it really, really difficult to reliably anchor on a perception of lethargy because, you look down at your plate and you're like, hey, not a lot going on there. And you know how you feel in the gym, and it can really start to get a little bit distorted. And that was, to me, one of the craziest things. The most recent prep that I did, I didn't track any calories or macros or anything like that. I basically started out with a diet that had enough protein and kept me weight stable. And I said, okay, the diet starts now. I'm going to remove this.
Yeah.
And I did that all throughout my diet. I didn't even track my protein because I knew it was good enough when I started. I can ride that all the way through.
Yep.
And it actually was, not everyone can do that. It doesn't really take a special kind of like, I'm not saying it's for the people that are better at this. It's just for a certain kind of mindset, temperament, etc.
Has to be a lot of monotony in your diet for you to be able to pull that
Tremendous.
off. If you're traveling and stuff, like you have no idea what you're eating anymore.
It has to be a tremendous amount of monotony, and you have to be the kind of person who, you know, some people, they would freak out if they weren't weighing and tracking everything they ate, you know. But for me, I found a huge psychological benefit of, I was like, I don't even really know how many calories I'm eating right now, which is fine because my weight is trending the way I want it to. And I'm not sitting here moping and catastrophizing about the fact that I'm a grown adult man eating what was probably 1,500 calories a day, right?
Something a child would need.
Yeah. So it can be really helpful to kind of get ahead of some of those psychological. I'm sure I would have convinced myself I was more lethargic if I was actually interacting with that number on a day-to-day basis late in my diet. But yeah, if you believe that you can get a really good, reliable indicator of your level of lethargy, that's great. One thing that's true, at least for me, is that sometimes people can tell you about your lethargy better than you can.
Yeah.
Like, I was running a few fairly big studies at the time that I was prepping, and people are like, Eric, why don't you sit up at your desk anymore? I was just like melted on my desk, like my literally cheek on desk, because I was like, who has the energy to keep their head up, right? And so like people will tell you like, hey, you look like you're literally falling apart because you won't even maintain your posture. And I was like, okay, maybe I am lethargic, you know?
One last question for you for this round. Let's say I dieted all wrong, way too aggressive. I have a crap load of metabolic adaptation now. And my long-term goal is to get substantially leaner. I'm not dieting for a show. I just hit maybe 12 weeks of dieting, and boy, did I just kitchen sink the thing and just cut 1,500 calories a day. Somehow just grit my teeth. My metabolism is severely suppressed. What is my best way out?
Yeah, the best way out there, because you still want to get leaner from that point, right?
Maybe not exactly that point. Maybe you can recognize that you got to get a little fatter first.
Okay.
But the answer is probably not go to Taco Bell and just say, I want everything on the menu. Let's get this party started.
Yeah.
What would be like a sensible plan of, do you need several months of diet break? Do you want to regain some body mass and body fat? Do you want psychologically to step off the gas of dieting and putting pressure on yourself to continually make PR so that you can kind of uncork a little bit? Or do you recommend just a full on, like, dude, just 2 weeks, just disappear and do fuck all? I suspect that's not the answer, but you know.
I would say the best case scenario moving forward there is you definitely take your foot off the accelerator, but you don't shift the car into reverse, right?
Got it.
So we've talked a little bit about metabolic adaptation. And metabolic adaptation, I would say, pertains to the stuff that sticks around even after you're at neutral energy balance. Mm-hmm. So like, okay, I dieted down, I lost 10% of my body mass, but I'm not dieting anymore. The metabolic adaptation, you retain a lot of that when you're at that new stable body weight. But it is important to recognize that there are other kind of reductions in energy expenditure associated with just being in an energy deficit. And so what that means is you can take your foot off the accelerator, go from an energy deficit to energy balance, and probably find that if you were still actually actively losing weight at that caloric intake, you should be able to increase your calories and just chill there for a little bit. And if you are still in a position where it makes sense to lose more body fat from that body fat level, I would suspect that by just getting out of that really large deficit, chilling there for, I would even say a month, maybe 2 months, just hang out, focus on your behavior, health behaviors, get into a routine, build some habits, get to the point where maintaining at that body weight feels very manageable, very automatic, build up that readiness to make another dive, right? And some people do this during their prep now, where they'll say, okay, I'm going to lose 40 pounds for this prep. I'm going to cut off the first 20. That'll be kind of the easier part. Once I start to run into some friction, chill there for a little bit, then we'll do part 2.
The double pump prep.
Exactly. So I think that there's, psychological benefits, and physiologically what really is happening there, in my opinion, when you do that little break in the middle, it's not that you are necessarily doing anything to like reset your metabolism, but you are helping convince yourself the things that felt terrible there when I decided I was at my limit. A lot of that was from the deficit. It was not from the amount of body fat you're currently carrying. And you actually can maintain this body fat level pretty comfortably. And once you've convinced yourself of that for a month or two, you say, okay, what if we do that next kind of dig? We go that next phase of the weight loss diet, but instead of going crazy with the deficit, let's make it a little bit more manageable.
Mm-hmm.
You can enter that phase with a lot more confidence. And like I said, I don't know of a really good diet strategy where I can say, we've got the evidence, this is going to dramatically attenuate metabolic adaptation. I only know of the ways that we can make it suck more. And having a really huge, aggressive, energy deficit is one of the best ways to make it suck way more. So you want to avoid that if you can. I hinted at the fact with refeeds, diet breaks, reverse dieting, things of that nature. I hinted at the fact that so far the research has come up really flat. We have not been able to design a really great study that shows, do these refeeds, do these diet breaks, you're going to get shredded and not have metabolic adaptation. But the research in that area, much of which I've been a part of, so I'm not just like throwing stones at other researchers, you have to really, if you want to really dig into that and have super conclusive findings, you really need to induce metabolic adaptation. Like the kind of analogy I draw on sometimes is like, if you're studying shark repellent, don't do it in a lake, because the placebo group and the repellent group, they're all going to have 0 shark bites.
Yeah,
right?
like deloading studies where no one accumulates any meaningful fatigue, and you're like, what are we deloading from exactly here?
Exactly. Yeah. So I will say, even being critical of my own studies in this area, we try to do it with the most relevant population that we can, get resistance trained people, get them dieting, but it is really, really tough, because if you want to induce metabolic adaptation in that population, you basically have to put them through like a bodybuilding prep.
Mm-hmm.
No one wants to do that for some random study that they're going to get like $25 to complete, and maybe some extra credit, right? So then you would say, okay, well then just study it in bodybuilders. Bodybuilders won't let you do anything. They're not going to hand over their prep
I'm not
strategy.
Be in the placebo group for my next show. I'm sorry.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not going to be in the placebo group. If you tell me to eat more carbs today and I don't want to, I'm not going to, right? Yeah. And I totally get that. So it's really difficult to study, and a lot of the underwhelming results that we've had in refeed and diet break studies specifically, they're in populations where, to be totally honest, I'm not certain that we're even going to be observing a great deal of metabolic adaptation in the first place. And so that's a huge weakness of that literature. So I haven't punted on it entirely, but what I can say for now is that so far, every time we swing, we look back and the ball's in the catcher's mitt. We kind of whiff every time, but we're working on it. We're going to keep trying.
Excellent.
Yeah.
On pure hypotheticals, if you're not comfortable with any kind of real literature-based assessment here, just hypothetically, maybe theoretically, leptin receptor modulation, promising theoretical area of future research? Because it's a very tractable problem for like an AI-powered drug discovery lab to be like, oh yeah, like we can just make it so that all of your cells that have the hypothalamus, we just basically say like, here's all the leptin receptors, and now we've either completely desaturated them and they can't be saturated, or we completely saturated them and they're just off. Is that something that you were like, if we action that, was easier said than done, but if we pull it off, could we see a world in which metabolic adaptation simply just almost doesn't happen anymore?
We really wouldn't even need that. There's not a ton of research in this area, but the research that has been done is super straightforward and like pretty compelling.
Okay.
If you just give recombinant leptin, you reverse almost all of metabolic adaptation.
IV administration or intramuscular injection kind of situations, because that's not orally bioavailable.
No, not orally.
But that's probably a solvable problem too if you clip some stuff onto it.
It's so far the studies I've seen, they do injection. I don't remember if it's intramuscular or intravenous, but yeah, if you just give exogenous leptin, you can reverse most of this stuff, and so it's not really all that hard from a pharmacological perspective, because your leptin receptor sensitivity at that point, when you're dieted down, you have metabolic adaptation, it's like infinite, right? Yes. It's really not a receptor issue at all. It's just there's just no leptin, right?
Yeah.
where it would get interesting with receptors is on the other side of that coin, which is when leptin was discovered, people thought, great, we're going to solve obesity. No, we won't, because the receptors, once leptin is super high, they basically get saturated, doesn't really do anything. When people are super lean, we can just give enough exogenous leptin to basically, without even worrying about any kind of receptor issues, we just get rid of the metabolic adaptation, right? But what we don't do is give them high enough levels that then they like starve themselves, right? Like we can get rid of this effect that has been induced.
Yes.
But we can't like there's some studies, for example, in rodents where they do ablation of actual clusters of neurons in the hypothalamus,
Sign
right?
me up, baby. The
Right.
ultimate
So
prep diet.
And so like ultimately that's where these leptin receptors are, right? There have been ablation studies where depending on which cluster of neurons you're doing ablation on, you can get rodents. And as someone who doesn't eat meat, sorry folks, this is not a very kind experiment to the animals, but you can do an ablation and get these animals to an extent where they are so ravenously hungry that they will actually, some of the rodents die in the study because they choke on their food. They are just
been
like,
there post-show, to be honest.
yeah, but they are eating so ravenously that they will literally choke on their food and die because their hunger circuits are just completely out of control.
Yeah.
At the same point, you can do an ablation where these mice will like just voluntarily decide, I'm going to go ahead and starve myself to death.
Yes.
Not worried about it. I'm fine. So with exogenous leptin, we're never going to get that kind of effect because of those sensitivity things. Like if you just ramped it up for someone who's already lean, eventually some of those receptors would desensitize and things like that.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I think the interesting element of receptor modulation would be on the other side of the coin as an anti-obesity intervention of saying, how do we take someone who has chronically high leptin and attenuate that desensitization of those receptors so that we can actually get leptin's effects on the other side of the spectrum? Yes. Although I will say, do we really need to do that now with GLP-1s? Like, would that have an additive effect or would it be redundant? I don't know.
From someone who uses GLP-1s as a drug-using cheater asshole, and just in general, bad person, just for the record.
Sure.
Just guess I knew that already. I believe it would be a big additive effect.
Cool.
Because the GLP-1s definitely kibosh your hunger to the extent that you would like. They do not do much about lethargy.
Okay.
Anything at all, especially the fourth gen Ozempic or semaglutide tirzepatide. Retatrutide, have you heard about retatrutide yet? So retatrutide I have taken. It's not available from commercial pharmacies, so don't ask me where I got it or if it's really retatrutide, but it does attend to that problem a little bit from the glucagon mechanism, which we had no idea even regulated metabolism to that extent, but apparently it does.
Yeah.
That the retatrutide data so far is baffling because it's like people can lose this much weight and feel okay because it attends to that expenditure side.
Yeah.
So if we end up getting like a quadruple agonist plus leptin, retatrutide plus leptin or whatever, I think that might be one of those drugs that it's like, here's this pill if you just don't ever want to be obese. And we might get to that level. But you seem to think that some of the stuff on leptin, some combination of just giving you leptin and also modulating receptor activity, you think those are potentially future tractable pharmacological problems. Is that a decent caricature of your opinion?
I'm not one to doubt the pharmacology folks out there. I think, if you can dream it, they can do it eventually. So
Eric Trexler, officially paid for pharma shill, will give you your Pfizer check after this interview.
That'd be great. Yeah, I am hoping to maybe get into some research on the GLP-1 agonist. So I'm still I'm gonna have to pick your brain about that to see how I can most effectively design a study in that area.
The constrained energy expenditure model. I just helped. There's a YouTube channel called In a Nutshell. That's got a German word before it I can't pronounce, Kurgistat or something.
Perfect. Beautiful.
Insert politically incorrect joke at the expense of German people here. I helped them out with a video on that touched on why you can't usually just exercise your way into infinite fat loss and weight loss. And the entire time that I was consulting them, I had two ideas. Like, one, I'm really happy to help. And two, I'm not the best guy to go to for this, but you are the best guy to go to for this. One of them, in any case. Tell me what we used to think about energy balance, and thus what we implied about why modern societies have such high levels of obesity. I can caricature my own view really quickly, and you let me know if it's okay.
Sure.
We thought that modern obesity largely arose from two factors. People are overeating and are substantially less active than we were in our ancestral environment. That seems to pass like almost like some kind of deep vibe check, like, of course it's both of those things. But is that really the case? And what is the constrained energy expenditure model?
Yeah. I think a lot of people, like you're alluding to, kind of oversimplified. Like, if people just moved more, then they would burn the type of calories we used to burn in our evolutionary history, and then we'd all be lean and happy. And if we were
in history.
Yeah, if we just avoided, like the ultra processed foods and just moved more and things like that. And so that really underpins the concept of the additive model of energy expenditure, which is pretty simple. It's my normal, day-to-day energy expenditure is pretty flat. And if I decide that I'm going to do an extra 100 calories per day of exercise, then my total daily energy expenditure is going to go up by 100 calories per day. And that's simple. And simple things are nice.
Yeah.
But simple things aren't always how it goes in reality. Yeah. And the constrained energy expenditure model comes from a series of observations indicating that when people try to increase their energy expenditure by 100 calories per day, their actual total daily energy expenditure goes up by typically less than that.
How much less, if you can give us a vibe check on that?
Sure. On average, only 70% of what we'd expect. So a 30% compensation.
Was that terrible?
No.
Right?
No.
But, and we'll get to this later. Actually, fuck it. Let's just get to it now. As you crank up to 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 800 extra calories, that's not 30% anymore. That changes, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a nonlinear effect. The more that you push, the more compensation that occurs. And huge factor, your energy status matters a lot. This is where the more recent research has kind of led us. But if we look at folks who are going to do more exercise and just adequately replace all those calories with their dietary intake, they probably won't compensate that much at all, as long as they're not doing crazy amounts of cardio. But if you are trying to induce an energy deficit and you succeed from doing extra cardio, there will be substantially more compensation. And that's why these longitudinal studies where they say, hey, we're going to have you do this much cardio per day and you're going to get super lean and we're all going to be happy. You can crunch the numbers and people end up losing sometimes half of the weight we would predict mathematically, sometimes less than half because of this compensation.
So it happens, but it's incrementally more underwhelming the more you try to push exercise as the modality by which we're going to generate a deficit.
Right.
Who is Herman Poncer? What did he do in his research? And what is Poncer's paradox?
I don't even know what Poncer's paradox is, to be honest.
It's a clever name the internet came up with for what he found.
Oh, okay. Sure.
It's nice, though. It's alliteration.
Yeah. I know Herman. I see him every day.
Excellent.
Herman's my boss.
You got to tell him, like, hey, you know you have a paradox, right? You got to look that up.
Yeah, I wonder if he knows that. Probably. But so I work in Herman Poncer's lab.
Oh, holy crap. All right. You're the guy to ask.
Did you not know that?
I knew that.
Okay.
I suspected it highly.
Actor.
I've heard the rumor mill.
Yeah. So I work in Herman Poncer's lab doing research there. And he, he's an evolutionary anthropologist. He's not an exercise scientist. Right. So I'm the outsider there. When we do our seminars on Fridays, sometimes it's about lemur ankles, and sometimes it's about species of hominids that haven't existed for tens of thousands of years.
That's way cooler than what we do.
Oh, it's great. I love it. It's really, really cool. But I'm like the weird guy who studies like modern day humans who move around.
You're like, let's get back to treadmills.
Yeah.
Oh.
But, Herman has done a lot of work in populations with low levels of industrialization, so more subsistence-oriented economies, things like hunter-gatherer communities, pastoralists who basically they take care of their herds, they do some small-scale farming.
Horticulture versus agriculture.
Exactly, yeah. And so within these populations, it's not at all unusual to see folks, depending on their role in the community, averaging 25, 30,000 steps a day, right? Now, if you tell a person who works a desk job and has like a family, hey, I want you to get 9,000 steps a day, they're like, I'll try, like maybe, right? So, I mean, it's not unusual at all to see those types of step counts. So intuitively, you know, doing research over there with doubly labeled water, accelerometry, people would think we're going to clock their steps at 30,000 a day, depending on their role in the community. And we're going to see really high energy expenditures, which is why in these populations, people tend to be quite lean. They tend to have extremely low rates of, you know, cardiometabolic disease, metabolic syndrome, things like that. And at the end of the day, they were finding really high step counts, really lean people who don't get, you know, heart disease, diabetes, all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, energy expenditures were not off the charts like they expected. They were actually pretty typical for when compared to other fairly sedentary populations.
Adjusted for body mass.
Adjusted for body mass, absolutely.
And discovered via doubly labeled water.
Correct.
Which has criticisms methodologically, but really is a pretty fine-tuned way of going at it.
It's really good. Yeah, I mean, no method's going to be perfect, but if you want total daily energy expenditure from a human being doing what they normally do, it's your first, second, and third best option.
Yeah, right. And so this is one hell of a trip, because earlier you essentially said that something like 90 or 85% of the adaptations for metabolism are in NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And now we're saying, even accounting for step count, which is probably in the real world for most of us who can't just have a doubly labeled water drink every time we want, the best way to try to account for that sort of NEAT, step count wise, you're saying even though these folks are getting 25, 30,000 steps a day, something else is making their net metabolism not crank like we would expect. Mm-hmm. And the data is, in your estimate, I'll give you three options and you can just kibosh all of them and just go from there. Curious and speculative, relatively well supported, but with some unanswered questions quite large, or starting to accumulate to the point of like, this is really what's happening and we just have to deal with it. Where are we closest to on that?
Between B and C.
Snap.
Okay. I don't know a lot of people who would argue very forcefully that the additive model of energy expenditure just works across the board. We just have too many pieces of evidence in very different populations for people to say there is no such thing as exercise energy compensation. But there are still massive questions about what elements of energy expenditure are actually adapting. I have a pet theory, and I want to be clear that I'm going out on a limb and I don't represent any of the smart people I work with when I say stupid things on podcasts.
Okay, so this is an official statement from Ponser's Lab. Got it.
Yeah. I got into studying energy expenditure because I thought metabolic adaptation was fascinating. When I first heard about exercise energy compensation, I thought it was a totally distinct thing that was also interesting. I am now starting to see the Venn diagram as overlapping far more considerably than I used to. And I think when we talk about reductions in NEAT, there are two ways we can look at that. One is kind of the behavioral, whether it's volitional or non-volitional, just doing less stuff, right? And so much of that, but not all of that, will show up in a step count, right? But also, there is some very interesting evidence from metabolic adaptation world indicating that when people are, adapting metabolically to a lack of energy, which again, we see more exercise energy compensation in an energy deficit.
Yes.
There's some clear parallels there. We see that it's not necessarily just that they're taking fewer steps, but also that steps cost less.
You get more efficient.
More efficient. And what's really fascinating, there's some cool studies by Rosenbaum's group at Columbia, 15, 20, 25 years ago, where they looked at the metabolic efficiency of folks who were doing different exercise intensities after a 10% body weight reduction. And what they found was people were burning way fewer calories per unit of exercise, but specifically at low intensities. And they were, for some reason, not utilizing carbohydrate the way they typically would. There was a big shift toward utilizing more fat as fuel. And what was really interesting about that was they still had the capability to burn carbohydrate. Like, it's not that, it's like with ketogenic diets, when people adapt to it, if you do glycogen loading and then say, great, go do a long race, they can't even use the carbohydrate that you just gave them. They don't have the enzymatic metabolic machinery to utilize it.
They just cramp faster.
Exactly, yeah. With these folks, they still retained the ability to actually do that substrate switching, but there was just some preference being driven toward utilizing fat, doing it more efficiently, and literally burning fewer calories per pedal stroke on the bike at low intensities. And the reason that's really cool is because when you're talking about the energy cost specifically of low intensity activities, it really helps you understand how, like, oh, so we could actually measure you getting those 25,000 low intensity steps a day. And we would think, oh yeah, NEAT should be totally unchanged.
A step is a step is a step.
But when you talk about a small increase in efficiency and then you multiply it by 30,000, you get a number that's a lot bigger than it was before you multiplied it by 30,000. So it's a really fascinating thing that I think we're starting to fill in some of these gaps. We need a lot more research, but absolutely. I think a lot of folks would say, the energy expenditure in these different, whether we're talking about elite endurance athletes, we're talking about hunter-gatherer communities, compensation's happening. The arguments are about to what extent, in what context, and what is the actual component of energy expenditure that's changing.
That makes amazing sense. So this model isn't saying or proposing that physical activity doesn't matter at all, because I've seen unfortunate misinterpretations of this, like, just doesn't matter, bro, exercise doesn't do anything, and because it's clearly false. So what is it saying? Can you give us a pithy take on how we can say, okay, maybe I can't exercise my way to whatever low body weight that I want, but at a certain level of exercise, doing much more is just some combination of impractical, inefficient, and uncomfortable, and I should maybe shoot for like a moderate high level of activity pegged during my diet and not try to go to high, super high? What's your take on how to properly interpret this?
Yeah, so I've had people who ask me, like, oh, you work with Herman, right? I say, yes. So you mean to tell me that an Olympic endurance athlete burns the same number of calories per day than, me behind my desk?
Yep, to the man, every person.
Of course not. That's right. Ridiculous, right? So I think the easiest kind of take home point from the application of this model is exercise is an incredible thing. It's one of the best things you can do for your body, right? If you want to maintain proper health, both physical and mental, exercising is a good thing.
Huge new research on the mental benefits all the time.
Absolutely. Also, exercise in some cases can actually help you regulate your appetite better.
Yes.
Some people notice that when they are extremely sedentary and then they go to being moderately active, they reduce their calorie intake and they engage in less hedonic eating. Eating gets more closely coupled to their actual physiological energy needs rather than just the hedonic reward of something that tastes good.
Yes, I've noticed that with sleep loss as well. If you're lacking in sleep, man, Cheetos look real good. If you're well slept, you're like, I kind of want broccoli.
Oh, there's clear evidence on that. Yeah, sleep restriction completely throws appetite regulation out of whack.
I love it.
And exercise also impacts sleep. Like people who exercise sleep better.
Yes. Yeah. I was actually just on a podcast, the Diary of a CEO podcast. I can neither legibly write in a diary nor am I CEO. I don't know. I was on there, but Stephen did mention, he was like, well, so if people are exercising, doesn't that increase their appetite and just kibosh the whole thing? And I was like, actually, no. The relationship, as far as I understand it, please correct me, for the average person, if you marginally increase their physical activity, there's not a predictable effect on increasing their appetite in a way that you're like, yep, you're going to want to eat more food. And for some people, there's less, some a little more, but on average, it's kind of no one showed up to the party sort of effect. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the effect seems to be nonlinear. That's come up a lot today, which is frustrating. We like linear things because they're easier to interpret.
Yeses and no's, man.
More is either better or worse. Yeah. So what we find is going from very sedentary to moderately active actually tends to improve appetite regulation.
Amazing.
But then for most people, not
Yes,
for
of course.
all.
Always averages, always exceptions.
But then when you start to go from like moderate to super active, we see that because you've recoupled your appetite to your actual energy needs, then it just kind of goes right up linearly, as you know, because you need to replace those calories.
Yes.
Right. So it's this really interesting kind of nonlinear pattern. But yeah, when most people are like, well, I should exercise more for my health, but I don't want to have an increased appetite and then gain more weight. It's like, don't worry about that at all. But the take home from our current understanding of, the constrained energy expenditure model is that exercise is fantastic for your health. It's a very important thing to do, but it is an extremely inefficient tool for weight loss. And what we tend to find, in the context of weight loss and like general population is that in most cases, your approach to weight loss ought to involve some amount of exercise just because exercise is good in general. Like you should be it doesn't matter if you're trying to lose weight or not. Our kind of default assumption is if you want to be a human who feels your best, you should be exercising.
Flat out. Or just at least.
If you can.
Yeah, and just to be super clear, it's not just exercise. Exercise is a willful, meaningful thing you take time, definitionally, out of your day to do for the ostensible purpose of increasing your health or modifying other behaviors. Physical activity.
Right.
That's the big one.
Yeah.
And exercise is usually what we end up having to do because everyone sits at a desk and you can't exactly push the desk around.
Yeah. So our understanding is that for optimal human health, having at least a moderate level of physical activity is really critical. But when it comes to actually inducing weight loss, the decision to just add more exercise to accomplish that is usually extremely inefficient. And the more extreme you go with it, the more inefficient it becomes, which is super frustrating. So we view exercise as a health tool, or I do. I view exercise as a health tool, and I view diet as a weight loss tool. And I try to keep those somewhat distinct.
Okay. You answered 3 questions at the same time, my man.
There you go.
The way I tend to think about it is exercise will help set like on your burner on the stove. If you set it to simmer, that really helps. You don't want to turn it off.
Right.
But if you go to super high, you just get into more problems than solutions at that point. So even for weight loss, a moderate, or what I would describe as step count wise, only in reference to averages in America, moderate to moderate high.
Yeah.
8, 10, 12,000 steps a day. Rock on, man. Everyone who's trying to lose weight should be targeting something like that numbers. But if someone's like, what if I can do 20,000? Like, dope. If that's your vibe, amazing. But it's not going to be like, oh, but can I also eat way more calories? Like, that's not going to pan out for you more than likely. Is that a decent take?
I completely agree. Yeah, I have noticed as someone who has gone from like really active to really sedentary at different times in my life, I do find weight loss to be more manageable, easier, and more enjoyable when I do have, like you said, at least a moderate to moderate high level of activity. I do think it has a pretty big impact more on the appetite side than anything else. But yeah, I think it's really important from my perspective to get people out of the idea that exercise is a tool you leverage to increase total daily expenditure to induce weight loss. I think that is not the best way, not the most constructive way to view it. I think viewing it as a supplementary thing that can make weight loss more manageable, more tolerable, and is also just good for you, I think that's kind of the better way to contextualize. And when I say exercise, again, I'm talking about general physical activity.
Yes.
So general physical activity, critical for health. For people that we're usually interacting with, resistance training, critical for the kind of physique you're trying to accomplish.
Sure.
And then diet, ultimately, the critical thing for inducing fat loss.
So you want to be healthy and well and lean and strong. Exercise and high levels of physical activity, moderate high, sort of non-negotiables in the modern landscape. But if you want to meaningfully lose lots of weight, you gotta look at the diet side to crank that.
Yeah.
Seemingly passes the vibe check for you.
Yeah.
What's an example how not understanding this idea can lead people who want to be leaner or lose weight down a suboptimal path, where if you could go back in time and just to be like, don't do this, do this other thing.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Oh, I actually think it's not like I have to dig for some kind of random. I think this is most people in the general population, their interaction with weight loss attempts. Like when you talk to someone and they say, I'm going to try to lose weight. And you say, oh, cool. Are you going to reduce your caloric intake? Try to quantify it and then make a reduction or make some kind of, qualitative change to your diet that's going to induce a calorie deficit.
Less junk food, something.
Right. Yeah. Usually people say, no, I'm going to start jogging. Right. And you're just like, and I never discourage that because I always, great. You're taking active steps to, exercise more autonomy over your health.
And that will help a little bit. Absolutely. With weight loss.
Yeah. And it'll be good for many reasons. Right. But I do think that there's just this, this really huge misunderstanding, and it leads a lot of people to the situation where when they decide that they're going to engage in weight loss and really try to build some self-efficacy and autonomy about managing their own health and body mass and body weight, people start out by putting themselves directly in hard mode. And it's like, well, we could have made this tiny dietary adjustment to induce that level of weight loss and then done maybe a little bit of extra walking, get an extra 2,000 steps a day. But instead you went right to, I'm going to train for a half marathon or a 10K or whatever. And you are kind of taking out the hardest parts that are more likely to cause you like physical pain when you just get started, right?
Taking an inordinate amount of time.
A lot of time. You have to restructure your schedule, and it's the exercise, and then I got to find a time to shower before work, or I got to do this after work, and how am I going to get dinner for the kids? And it
We're
really
gonna run
is
to get dinner together as a family.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you really are kind of putting it right into hard mode, where if our only goal was to just like lose, a few pounds over the next couple months, like we could have made some really small tweaks to your diet that literally made no impact on your daily schedule, minimal impact on your the bulk of your diet. It could have just been a really small swap. And the result of that is people, when they jump right to hard mode, they start to get the impression, this is not for me.
Yes.
I can't do this, because when I was doing all this hard stuff that dramatically altered my day and made my knees and hips and low back feel like crap, I still didn't even make that much progress.
Yeah.
And that can be really deflating, and it can take a lot of folks, really, it can cause them to completely disconnect from even the ambition of saying, yeah, I'm really going to, build some self-efficacy and take my health into my own hands.
The way I've seen this play out, unfortunately, in many instances, it becomes almost like a demographic identity thing where people are like, exercise and weight loss, that's for those other folks over there. I'm not one of those folks. I tried the shit. It does not fit. And you're like,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's, I was really surprised by some of the fitness reactions when, the GLP-1 drugs, that research has been going on for actually a pretty long time.
20 years.
But the fitness world just started reacting to it within the last couple years, right? And I was really surprised that at first a lot of folks were like, but wait a minute, if people can get support for weight loss through a pharmacological intervention, what am I going to do as a fitness professional? And some people were feeling like, no, these drugs are going to like replace fitness professionals and we're screwed. And I was like, you are not just wrong, you're the opposite of right.
Yes.
I
feel like you're quoting me. I say that all the time.
I was like, you're so far off base that you are all the way on the other side.
You're not randomly wrong.
Yeah.
You're orthogonally wrong.
Yeah. So I was like, there are so many people who detach fully from fitness endeavors because they've had so many bad experiences. If we can give them something at the beginning that makes exercise less painful, if we can give them something that starts to build that self-efficacy and have them shift that identity and say, actually, I am the type of person who engages in exercise. I feel like I belong in these spaces and I feel better, like my body hurts less when I do these things and I have this momentum going. I was like, dude, you are going to have, if these drugs take off and they work the way we think they're going to work, and so far all signs point to pretty good, we are taking the potential fitness world from this big to this big, right? And it stunned me that that wasn't their first impression of it.
Oh my God. For Scott, the video guy's purposes of keeping these moderately long, you and I could talk about this for another 50 hours. Agreed, mega agreed. What research are you currently involved in? Because you do work in Herman Pouncer's lab, what do you guys have cooking that you can talk about publicly? I know there's a whole lot of classified research you guys do for nuclear powered government stuff that you told me earlier you can't talk about.
Right.
What's cooking? What's cooking in the lab? What do you guys have coming up that you're looking into?
It is funny you mentioned that because a lot of the doubly labeled water stuff is kind of in conjunction with the International Atomic Energy Agency, but I don't have any nuclear secrets. I certainly don't have the nuclear codes.
All the people who have that say the same thing.
Exactly, that's true. Our lab, it's really fun because we have so much diverse research going on. And I can't necessarily share a bunch of results, but like I can tell you, we've got folks in our lab who are working on the energy needs of pregnant and nursing women who also do a lot of exercise. You know, one of the things that's interesting about the constrained energy expenditure model is a lot of people talk about it in terms of like hunter-gatherer communities, or they talk about it in terms of weight loss and exercise interventions like that. But another place where it shows up is actually in elite endurance athletes.
Of course.
Because what you tend to find is it's not just that they do a lot of exercise, but also they their energy expenditure gets so high from the amount of just training they're doing.
Physical work.
That, you know,
one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, that they are literally unable to replace all those calories. Like it seems like when people try to
Challenge accepted.
Yeah, but like when people try to eat more than about 2.5 times their basal metabolic rate in calories every day, I know, Mike, you can do it in the short term. But if you try to do it for the next 9 or 12 months every single day, what we find is people really struggle to maintain that level of energy intake if they're maintaining that super high energy output as well.
It's a rough life.
It's really rough.
You're sweating 1,000% of the time.
Yeah. And so what's really interesting is like, we are curious in seeing like that kind of upper limit for sustainably, how high can you actually push your energy expenditure and replace those calories effectively, where you're not just like in a constant energy deficit, training a ton, and your body's just going to fall apart if you try to do that, right? So we've got stuff going on with like pregnant and nursing women who put in like pretty serious mileage as endurance athletes.
That's crazy to think about.
Yeah, and we always have stuff going on in energy expenditure and activity in more like subsistence oriented economies and populations.
Real quick.
Yeah.
You guys have to fly out and live on location for that stuff, right? Or do you collaborate with other institutions that are more proximately located there? How does that work?
We do a little bit of everything. We do have a member of our lab that kind of rotates, at least one who will go and do a lot of field work in Kenya.
Are you going to go to Kenya and stuff anytime soon?
Probably not, because I'm not... I'm like the weird exercise guy, and they're like, go stay by the treadmill. Like, that's what you do. But no, like, so we do field work, and then of course we collaborate with other groups that do field work, because, our lab has done research involving populations in various parts of Africa, in South America. And so it'd be really inefficient to literally fly out and do field work in every location. But that's the beautiful thing about doubly labeled water, is that it's tremendously stable. So we can even do studies with like elite ultra endurance athletes who are all over the world. You can ship out doubly labeled water and get urine shipped back in. And it's not like the type of thing where, we freeze it, but it doesn't have to be like super sensitive. Like the moment it's drawn,
right,
you're putting it in like dry ice and international shipping with biological specimens and dry ice is like a nightmare,
Mildly.
Yeah. So
what's in there? You're like, oh God, here we go.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So we're doing stuff with, pregnant women who exercise, some of these like hunter-gatherer type communities abroad, elite endurance athletes. I'm working with pastors for like a more health-oriented study, which is really cool because it kind of gets into some of the things we've talked about today, where it's like, what is the role of energy expenditure versus just the role of exercising to feel great physically, mentally. So that work is actually done in conjunction with some people who study the sociology of religion. And the job of a pastor, especially in rural communities, is really tough. Like you're really like a pillar in your community.
You kind of do it all.
You do it all. You're like part social worker, part theologian, part, you're there for everyone in your community.
Part construction worker.
Yeah. So there's the combined effects of being living in fairly under-resourced areas in the rural Southeast, and being this pillar in your community that does everything for everyone. And so it's really fascinating to take a look at more holistic aspects of, what role nutrition and exercise can play there in terms of physical health and mental health. Because a lot of people don't know this, but pastors, especially in the Southeast United States, their cardiometabolic health is actually worse than the general population. There's actually some health disparities that population experiences. And so we're trying to figure out why that is. And that's going to involve a mixture of psychology, sociology, and, good old fashioned physiology as well. Wow. So yeah, we have a lot of stuff going on at the lab, and it's, I love the flexibility and freedom that we have to just go after interesting questions and just go for it.
Real science.
Yeah, it's fun.
Someone's got to do it and not be a stupid influencer, purposeless YouTuber like someone. Amazing stuff. You ready for the next series of questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Unreal. Supplements.
Perfect.
Ranking supplements. How do we know what supplements work and what supplements work not so well, and then what supplements maybe just don't work at all?
You go to examine.com.
I love that website.
Yeah. They are great. They do great work, but
how do they know?
Exactly. I was going to say, but we should always, figure out how to formulate our own kind of independent assessment of things. Because sometimes, things come out and they haven't made a page on it. It's not often, but it has happened. With dietary supplements, I wish there was an easy way to go about just saying like, hey, here's this easy way to know for every supplement what exactly you can expect, right? But I have in mass research review, like we've had so many questions about supplements that I had to create some type of system or heuristic to just kind of categorize. Like we can at least put them in bins, right? So I like to talk about supplements in tiers.
Like you're crying
not as
while
I'm
you're
crying,
discussing. Okay, I got it.
Tier 1, tier 2, and so on.
You guys don't use God tier, S tier, mid tier.
No, we should. And sometimes
a modern taxonomy.
Sometimes with supplement research, you also are in tiers because you're just like, how do they get away with this?
For sure.
Right? But anyway, so yeah, I like to put them in 5 tiers, and that's when someone comes to me and says, hey, what about this one? It's easier for me to say tier 3.
I love it.
Take what you will,
Eric, please talk us through the tiers. This is fascinating stuff, and I will arguably start crying.
Yes.
Tears of joy, of course.
Yeah. So tier 1, best of the best, right? And it's important to recognize these tiers, they only work when you have a pairing. So it's not just, is creatine a tier 1 supplement? It's for what outcome is creatine a tier 1 supplement, right? So whenever someone wants me to like, hey, what tier would this fall in? It's like, well, what are you trying to do?
Yes.
Right? And that's critical.
Although with the way most supplement research has kind of come out, a lot of it is actually just, and I'm not disagreeing. The way you're doing it is flawless, but a lot of supplements just have no tier in which they do anything. So you don't even have to ask that question.
Yeah.
Like, what do I need to use XYZ powder potion pill for? Like, well, there's actually no use for it at all. So it's tier nothing on nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. So tier 1 basically means we have strong evidence. We know what this thing does, and what it does is good, and it matters. Like this is a meaningful effect that is reliably observed, and we have good evidence to support that. So for most lifters who are like, hey, I want to be big and strong and jacked, what supplements are tier 1? It's a short list. It's creatine, assuming you're not a non-responder, and it's protein if you're not eating enough protein from your food.
Sure.
Right?
Casein, whey, egg, that whole thing.
Sure. Yeah. But if you're eating enough from your food, who cares? Forget it. Yeah. Right? So tier 1 is a lonely spot to be.
What's this? It's just 2 things.
For lifting, yeah. Like for building muscle, building strength, that kind of deal. Yeah. Tier 2, that's where things get a little bit more interesting. I think tier 2 is the most interesting tier.
The tier of promise.
Exactly. So tier 2 basically says, okay, there is some evidence related to this supplement for the outcome we're interested in, and it actually looks pretty good. But it's not on tier 1 because it has some shortcoming. So maybe the initial evidence is pretty good, but I'd like to see more of it before I get super stoked. Or we have a ton of evidence, but the effect is just kind of small.
Interesting. Okay.
Or we have a ton of evidence and the effect is inconsistent based on factors that we actually know. Right.
On average positive, but more stochastic than you would like to see it.
Right. Or it only works in like really unique situations.
Oh,
you know, so it's
deficiency
like deficiency or like, for example, when someone says, hey, I lift and I do cardio and I do team sport type of activities, should I have beta alanine?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I need to know a little more about your training, right? If you are doing like a 3x5 powerlifting program, beta alanine is not going to do much for you.
What about the tingle, Eric?
You can get the tingle and that'll be great. When I was an undergrad, we had a little lab class where we had to like make up a little pretend experiment to all do, kind of learn how it works, right? Yeah. And no one wanted to do beta alanine for our little fake lab experiment. And I insisted. I was like, we got it. It's so cool, guys. This is when I was like in my big supplement era as a person. And so finally we convinced them to do it. And the TA accidentally messed up the dose for us and gave us, I think it was like 8 times the dose we were aiming for. And the whole class was just like, it was like someone released like a hive of bees in the room. And everyone's just looking at me like, great idea, Eric. This was, of all the things we could have done. I should have said, you should thank me that we didn't do sodium bicarbonate because...
that comes the other end.
Exactly. Tingling is better than that. But anyway, right. Yeah, so tier 2 basically means like you can have a really solid evidence-based justification for this. However, you're likely going to have to acknowledge this is a really marginal effect. Like maybe this only matters for a competitive athlete.
Marginal and or conditional.
Yeah, or conditional where it's like, well, for you, that makes a lot of sense. But for your friend over there, there's no reason for you to be taking that. So this is where most of the fun stuff falls, where it's like things that are promising, they're kind of, we're interested to see how they might materialize, or there's some places where you use them and some places where you don't. So for example, in the lifting world and the kind of high intensity athletics world, you'll find things like sodium bicarbonate, beta alanine.
You got to be real careful with sodium bicarb. By the way, guys, if you didn't catch the reference last time, the first time the first research into sodium bicarbonate was based on theoretical inference. And they were like, this has to buffer acid in a way that really makes your short-term endurance, 400, 800 meter, like really profoundly better.
Yeah.
And they dosed it nice and high, and they realized it predictably causes explosive, uncontrollable diarrhea.
Correct.
And that was fun. Yeah. Until it wasn't.
Yeah. It turns out, when strong bases react with strong acids in your stomach, that matters.
Something comes out.
Things happen. Yeah. So yeah, you have to be really careful with the dosage. And there's some new dosing strategies that are kind of like smaller doses over extended periods of days, things like that.
Fuck that. Double scoop that shit.
Yeah. That's the one thing where no one gets tough. Like pre-workouts, 2-3 scoops. No one's doing that with sodium bicarb. But beta alanine, sodium bicarb, citrulline malate.
Okay, citrulline's in that dope. I used to talk about citrulline all the time.
Yeah.
And I actually watched your arc of you getting excited about it and publishing in various outlets. And then you were like,
I mean, if you're getting into science, like that was an element of my dissertation research, right? And if you're getting into science for the right reasons, in my opinion, you go into it because you don't know the answer.
That's really the only reason to go into science.
Right.
But whatever.
Yeah. Like I'm not there to prove a point. Right.
So slowly backwards.
So I was seeing this interesting citrulline research emerging, and dietary nitrate I also put in tier 2. And I was saying, this stuff is cool. And, nitric oxide supplements have been a staple for lifters since Ronnie Coleman on the NO Explode with the giant bicep vein.
That's how he got the veins.
Yeah. I mean, so from the day I was into lifting, everyone was saying, your life changes the day you start taking arginine. And then we're like, okay, arginine kind of sucks, right? But good premise, and we can probably do better with citrulline or dietary nitrate, right? So I got really interested in those supplements. Emerging research was pretty positive. And it's not like it totally fell off. Like there's still good reason to supplement with those in certain instances.
Can you tell us a quick story, just a super quick story about citrulline malate? What is it good for, and who could consider taking it?
So citrulline malate so far seems to be good for strength endurance, which in the research world, that's the term we use for when we're talking about cranking out a couple more reps, basically. And so citrulline malate, I published a meta-analysis on it a few years ago. I'm old now, so actually it was probably more than a few, but
I always say a few, and then it was like 15, and I'm like, oh, shit.
Not there yet, but it actually was, I guess, kind of a while ago. But, published that meta-analysis and said, yeah, like there's a, small effect size around the like 0.2-ish range for a Cohen's D, which is like, okay, that's detectable, it's measurable, it's statistically significant, but like, do you care about that effect size? Maybe, depends, right? So, and then another meta-analysis came out like 2 years later, and basically in a slightly different research question, returned basically the same effect size. So then I said, okay, now we're feeling pretty good about it, right? So I think those are the areas where we have the most literature so far. What I'd be interested to see is how perhaps it can affect things like power, like in more explosive muscle movements. The reason I say that is dietary nitrate has been more studied for power outcomes and endurance outcomes. Dietary nitrate seems to be really good for high velocity muscle actions, producing more power output. Yeah. And that's important because a lot of the citrulline studies, they don't really emphasize a lot of really high velocity movements. So I'm not really sure yet if it's going to have that same effect on power.
And that's why, one of the reasons why it's tier 2.
Yeah. And even if it did impact power, to be totally honest, like for me to put something on tier 1 with protein and creatine, it needs to have an effect that is important enough to say, yeah, those three are going to be on the same level.
Yes.
So I don't think citrulline will ever get there. Right. And that's okay, because tier 2 is a totally fine place for a useful supplement to live, right? And one other one, common one that I would put on tier 2, in addition to citrulline dietary nitrate, I would also put caffeine. Because
why tier 2? We're going to get a lot of
1?
flack for this. Where has caffeine in tier 1? I'm taking 18 grams of Ronnie Coleman's pre-workout for what?
Yeah. So caffeine's interesting because I can say, yeah, there are meta-analyses and even like umbrella reviews indicating it should have a positive effect on things like strength endurance, power. But when you look at the effect sizes and the consistency, caffeine is actually probably better for endurance sport than it is for resistance exercise. And one other thing with caffeine is we don't yet fully understand, in my opinion, the time course and degree of habituation that occurs when you use caffeine before your workout, every single workout.
Experientially, it's not great.
Right. And we don't know when you get to that point, when you say, I wouldn't dare work out without my pre-workout caffeine. Is that because it's still giving you an ergogenic effect, or is it because caffeine withdrawal gives you an ergolytic effect and your performance sucks?
Scott, what do you think?
No comment.
We've all had our ups and downs with caffeine.
Yeah. And so another reason, aside from the unknowns about the time course of habituation, the acute time course of withdrawal, how that impacts performance in the gym.
Yeah.
Another element is I've been getting really into sleep because I like feeling good.
Weird.
Yeah. There's this weird thing about me where I like to wake up refreshed and spend my whole day feeling great. And
that ain't it, man.
Right. And so if you tell me, hey, I lift weights at 6 a.m. before I go to work, I say, great, knock yourself out.
Scoop it up.
Yeah. But if you're telling me that you're like sitting at your desk at 5 p.m. and you're taking the double scoop of pre-workout to get your, super intense workout from 6 to 7:30, and then you're like, I
6
did
to 6:30.
That 7:30.
I was saying, like, what people consider super intense is really 30 minutes of actual work. Like, do you really need 2 scoops for this, or what the hell is going on?
That's true. Now I get you.
Coffee exists.
Yeah, exactly. But and then they're like, I did notice that I stare at the ceiling for 3 hours a night, and it's like, yeah,
but very intently.
Yeah, you took like 600 milligrams of caffeine like 6 hours before you tried to go to bed.
For the record, at least back in the day, I think this is still true, Ronnie Coleman's pre-workout formula in one serving size has 550 milligrams of caffeine. How much is in a cup of coffee typically?
Usually about 100.
Is this Scott's video guy? Does that make any sense to you?
It's intense.
Well, I will say this. If you want to convince a consumer there's stuff in here,
you got to put a lot of stuff in
500 there's like 500
have more than the competition.
if that was your goal, 500 milligrams of caffeine, 6 grams of beta alanine, no one is going to feel that there was nothing in that scoop, right? But yeah, probably going to have some folks who are like, yeah, I'm never touching that stuff again.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Okay. So caffeine, kind of a mixed bag because it has definitely some main effects that we're interested in, but there's some matching to lifestyle effect problems, interferes with sleep, and it's you can get used to it, and then maybe you're kind of dependent on it, and so that's why caffeine is tier 2.
Yeah.
What does tier 3 look like?
Tier 3 is where the vast majority of supplements live, and probably will live for a very long time, because it is the tier where I tell someone, I do not have enough evidence to say that there is a defensible use case for this, but I also don't have enough hard evidence to tell you there is no way this will work.
Amazing. And that's kind of intellectually where supplements kind of start. Like a new supplement would enter into tier 3 and look up and down and say, where am I going based on research?
Exactly. Unless we have, practically speaking, yes. The only exception to that would be like if something with an extremely well-known effect in the food supply at the dose it's being supplemented at is brought to market, and we already know that sucks. Like that is just bad for you.
Hurt you.
Yeah. So but that would never get to market, right? Because
well, let's not say never.
Well, yeah, you're right. But even supplement companies want to have enough meat on the bone that they can say, oh, this is going to be the greatest thing ever.
Yes.
Right?
Generally speaking, for-profit corporations have zero interest in hurting anyone because at the worst case, it's a legal liability, and sort of best case, it's terrible brand identity.
Yeah. I'm not going to pretend they're looking out for you, but they are definitely looking out for
themselves. 100%,
Yeah, 100%. So most supplements do fall there, and this is where there's a lot of contention because not everyone has the same threshold for when something's ready to move up from tier 3 to tier 2.
And it is a bit subjective.
It's completely subjective until you codify it and say, here are my official rules. And even then you might find you break your own rules.
Yes. And the rules are codified subjectively to begin with. So, but your system, Eric Helms told us about your system. And when he told us about your system,
he's been plagiarizing left and right.
He actually says he's you a lot. It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
You guys look almost identical, so it's strange. But I was ultra impressed with the system because yes, everything's subjective, everything's nuanced, but damn, a 5-tier system, the way you designed it is just so informative because once you learn about it, you're like, what tier is this? Someone's like tier 3, and you're just like, you're looking at it at the store. You're like, do I have extra money? Sure. Do I not? Fuck that.
Right.
But if it's tier 1 and someone's like, should I take this? You're like, oh, yeah, if you have the money, probably. What is tier 4 and how is that different from tier 5?
Yeah. So tier 4 is basically, we have evidence of what I would call a null effect. So I can look at the evidence for the supplement. It's not like there's nothing out there.
Right.
I can look at studies on it and say, this is not going to achieve what you want it to achieve. So this doesn't work is the simple explanation.
Isn't that great?
This doesn't work, and I know that to be true.
The supplement company CEO is like, Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. But it's not hurting you.
Correct.
It just doesn't do shit.
Right.
And that's probably also like huge numbers of supplements.
Yeah. I think without question, the vast majority fall in tier 3. The second biggest category is going to be tier 4, where it was promising in 1992 for about 6 months. Yeah. The first 2 studies looked great, and then the next 13 looked terrible, and we said, okay, don't know what happened with those first 2, but yeah.
Does glutamine fall into tier 4? For the purposes of getting you jacked and shredded, not intestinal health.
Right. I was going to say for clinical applications, talk to a doctor, dietitian, a real doctor.
Real doctor.
Although I always joke, my PhD technically came from the School of Medicine. So I always say like, well, back in med school when I was becoming a doctor.
Bro, you can straight up get up on a plane and start fixing people's hearts if
I
they
believe
pass
so.
out. Yeah.
I believe that's true.
They're like, are you a doctor? You're like, I did get my doctoral degree from a medical school. They're like, that's a weird roundabout way of saying that. Like, don't worry, he's going to be fine.
My lawyer told me to put it exactly that way.
this way and no other way.
Yeah. But yeah, so when it comes to like you said, getting jacked, performing better, yeah, I think we've pretty much shut the book on glutamine.
That's painful. Hey, Scott, that's a good reel, huh?
Yeah. Go short.
Yes, there you go. Can you list another few supplements offhand that might be tier 4 noteworthy? Maybe one more.
I would say arginine kind of sucks. Just because there's alternatives that are clearly tier 2,
Like what?
So like instead of arginine, you would just go straight to citrulline or nitrate.
Got it.
So I could never justify telling someone, yeah, arginine, go for it. I'm sure if you name a few more supplements, like everything that you can think of that's in the old supplement graveyard, that's what tier 4 is. The stuff that we thought was going to be super cool. Diaspartic acid as a test booster.
Yep.
Right? People were like, oh, this is going to be great. First study looked great. And then just totally flamed out.
Creatine ethyl ester does not leave the gut as creatine, apparently.
Yeah. And again, it's really easy to kind of view things as tier 4 when it's like, I have a cheaper alternative that does what that's trying to do infinitely better.
Yes.
So like
reliably so.
Yeah. Why in the world would I mess with it is a good reason to put it just in tier 4. Like, yeah. So creatine ethyl ester, even some of the, back in the day, people were really getting into the, buffered creatines.
Yes.
Like the alkaline creatines. And
creatine hydrochloride fall into another category like that.
I think
4?
Creatine hydrochloride, I wouldn't put it in. I think there's research indicating it has a decent effect, but I think its main shortcoming, if memory serves, is that it fails on the promise that kind of justified its existence.
Somehow better than monohydrate.
So like I've heard a lot of people who are like, I used to take 5 grams of creatine monohydrate, but now I take an ineffective dose of creatine hydrochloride because I was told I could get away with only taking 2 grams and it equals 5 of monohydrate. So that's where it fell short. And usually I'm pretty sure creatine hydrochloride still works, but you still would need to take it in a monohydrate-ish dose, and you would just be paying more for it. So it's not that we have evidence of null effect broadly, it's that we have no reason to overpay for it.
Amazing. Tier 5. What is tier 5?
Yeah, when I first started talking about this tier system and kind of started from 1 through 4, people were like, sounds like we covered it all. Why do you need tier 5? People kind of forget about tier 5 because when it comes to supplements, people are wired toward optimism in a lot of cases.
Not everything is inert, it turns out.
Right. And so a lot of times when people are going to try a supplement, they have this kind of faith. Well, if it's on the shelves, obviously the worst that could happen is I waste $25, right? But tier 5 is supplements that we have evidence conclusively indicating that one of two things is going to happen. Either this is going to literally harm your performance, or it is going to harm you. This is not a safe thing for you to take. Yeah.
Wow.
It's either bad for you or it's going to actively, it's not just going to have no improvement on performance. You will perform worse.
RP is a growing company. We're going to actually start a subsidiary company called Tier 5 Nutrition. Do you want to be an investor?
Sure. Yeah. I'd be happy to.
It's important to be tough in modern society. This
Correct.
coddling business. We're going to toughen you up by giving you stuff that's poisonous, or at the very least makes your physical training more difficult because now it's less efficacious. And that alone will get you mentally tougher.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say, start out your day with a 45-minute ice bath to build that toughness.
That's how I do it.
Exactly. Yeah. Hypothermia used to exist, but was largely overstated. So 45-minute ice bath straight into some tier 5 supplement that's just going to wreck your gut.
Yes.
And you will have no worse things happen to you that day.
The rest of the day is so great.
Yep.
That's what we're really giving you. Perspective.
Yep.
Are there any supplements currently still on the shelves that are tier 5, or can you tell us some that used to be on the shelves?
The most common scenario with tier 5 is that they actually started out as tier 2. They were like, okay, yeah, this actually does something. Or even depending on the outcome, maybe even tier 1. And we just found out it's just the side effect profile is not great. It gets banned. There's the tricky thing with tier 5 is that sometimes you could look at it and what I call tier 5, you might call tier 2, but everyone's kind of too worried about a small percentage risk of an adverse outcome, right? So Mike, I'm sure you remember back in the day, DMAA, geranium root.
Exactly what I was thinking of. Jacked 3D,
Yeah.
the original formula. Get that new formula out of my face.
Yeah, kids these days think they know about pre-workouts, but man, if you weren't around in like 2012 when that stuff was going
I want
crazy.
a pre-workout that's dangerous to take.
Yeah, as structurally similar to methamphetamine as you can get is kind of how they used to do pre-workouts. But yeah, so like back in the day, it was not banned by any athletic organization, certainly wasn't banned by the FDA, certainly wasn't a controlled substance by any means. So it was on every shelf at the major supplement stores. It was hard to find a pre-workout that didn't have it because frankly, why would you? It was
Golden
awesome.
era of pre-workouts.
Yeah, I mean, it was a fantastic stimulant. However, there were serious adverse events reported. I believe that there were a couple deaths, if memory serves, in military personnel that were attributed to, and whenever you have these types of things happen with supplements, then there's always the fighting, the kind of litigation that occurs in terms of like, well, did they die because of the supplement or did they die in proximity to the supplement while they already had an underlying heart condition? Or
people die for all kinds of reasons, and some of them also Venn diagram wise take supplements.
Right. And so there's all that kind of stuff. And that usually is the case when you have things like, another good example is like ephedrine, right? Like all the ephedra kind of umbrella of supplements that were used as like stimulants.
And so that's tier 5 to you.
What I do as someone who usually is interacting with people who are either broadly focused on general health or athletics in drug-tested federations, once it's banned by, all the big federations, then I say, all right, we're going to tier 5 it, you know? So like, yeah, it's the same kind of deal. People will debate. They'll say like ephedrine, different forms of it were effective stimulants. But again, there was, I believe, at least one baseball player died, and that was attributed to ephedra or ephedrine. And
so I remember some of those stories, some of the reports, and at least in one of them that comes to memory, I believe it was a football player, but he died, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But he was taking something like 10 times the recommended dose.
Yeah.
Can we still, no royal we here. Are you comfortable blaming the supplement, or how does that moral landscape work out for you?
Yeah. So again, that's why I cowardly hedged my bet and said, whenever you get one of these bans going, there's always that process of, okay, like, yeah, this person took a pre-workout supplement and died. However, maybe they had a much larger heart than the average individual, and maybe they were doing a really strenuous workout and it was 105 degrees and humid that day. And
they were taking 5x the dose.
Right. Whatever, yeah. And of course there's dosage considerations, there's drug interaction considerations potentially. So yeah, I would, for me to feel comfortable sitting down and making a determination, supplements guilty or supplements not guilty, I need to sit down with a literal dossier of evidence on like a case-by-case basis, which is one of the reasons that when it comes to my use of that tier system, rather than adjudicating every single banned ingredient and determining, was that a manufacturing quality issue? Was that a dosage issue? Was it a pre-existing condition issue? Was it a heat stress issue? For me, I will admittedly say I've outsourced some of that because for all intents and purposes, like if you are, not a competitive athlete, general population person, and do I really see a need for me to say, yeah, you should be taking this like really potent stimulant to accomplish your fitness goals? Generally not, right? And if you're a drug tested athlete, I'm definitely not going to tell you, hey, this banned supplement, let's do it, right? So for me,
want to win or not?
Yeah. So for my context, I would say once something becomes pretty universally banned, it ends up in tier 5 because someone has determined that there's at least enough concern about potential for harm, or it just doesn't fit the legal definition of a dietary supplement.
Sure.
Which technically isn't dangerous, but also means that it's going to be banned, it's going to be harder to find and things of that nature. So, but if I don't judge at all, but the untested side of sport is just a place where I don't spend my time. I don't have a lot of experience. Yeah. But if I did work in that area more consistently, then I probably would sit down with a few of these stimulants that are known to have appetite suppressing effects and, boost in energy expenditure type effect, thermogenic effects. I probably would sit down and have a more serious review of some of the underlying evidence to make my own determination of like, actually, I wouldn't have banned it,
Sure.
Yeah.
Eric, is there anywhere that you keep, and it seems like no, but is there anyone keeping a list of your tier system with supplements slotted into it? Like, can I go on some website on the internet and look up the tier system and see stuff in there that, of course, whoever's doing it, be it you or someone else, they have their biases, they have their predilections, etc. But just something, is there anywhere, like I know examine.com does kind of a narrative review on every supplement, but they're not using your tier system, I assume, though maybe they should.
I'm trying to license it to them, but
Get out of here, really?
They're very, very stingy. For a flat fee of $1 billion, I said, you can use this tier system all you want.
I think you're being generous.
Right. And they were under the impression that they were overpaying at that number. No, nobody uses it, to my knowledge. And I don't keep like a running list.
Right.
I probably ought to. People have recommended that to me, but I'm very busy, Mike. Got a lot going on.
Do you have another job? Several, in fact.
No, I do think it would be nice to kind of put something like that together, but I will acknowledge when people have brought that to my attention, my first thought was, oh yeah, good idea. That's easy. I'll do it. My second thought was it would be a bit of a bigger effort in the sense that you would have to make a kind of tier list for each prevalent supplement outcome. Right. So like you'd have to have your tier for endurance outcomes, strength, etc.
Muscle gain, general health.
Yeah.
Cognitive boosting.
Yeah.
Sleep, recovery.
So
the whole nine yards.
It's a great idea and it's completely feasible if it's going to be like, something you're really going to sink your teeth into and put some effort into it.
Somebody listening could make it. It would be wonderful if they did.
Yeah.
I would even pay good money to see, maybe not $1 billion, but I think 500 million is just a take home easy sum.
You would think.
Come on, it's 2024. Yeah. Elon Musk exists. I would like to see that your tiered taxonomy be applied to all supplements on all effects, because I honestly think there are so few supplements that do anything at all.
Yeah.
We're talking about 10 to 30 supplements in tier 1 and tier 2 altogether. For everything. Yeah. Maybe I'm wrong about that. What do you think, vibe check wise? Is that like...
No, I totally agree. And I think it would be really fascinating as someone who really enjoys data. I would just love to see the plotted distribution. Like if you just like paid somebody to just crawl through Examine, right? Mm-hmm. And say everything that's in their database, I want you to categorize on this tier system and, go outcome by outcome and just in aggregate, look at the volume of things in each tier. It would just be a massive sea of things in tier 3 and 4.
Yes.
And then, 1 would be a very lonely place and you'd have maybe a couple dozen that find their way into 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the record, anyone listening, Claude 3.5 and GPT 4.0 absolutely can do that already for you if you simply point it in the right direction.
Yeah. And I was just joking about the idea of trying to like monetize that idea. The idea is not good enough or unique enough to monetize. So
nonsense.
If someone out there wants to do it, by all means have at it. It'd be kind if you put a little footnote that said, I like Eric Trexler. He gave me the idea for this. But if you don't, my lawyers aren't coming for you.
Our lawyers will come for you, however, on your behalf.
There you go.
Next topic. Can you be too lean? In general, I'm kidding. Can you be too lean to gain muscle optimally?
I would say the answer is it kind of depends.
God damn it. Get off our podcast.
I know. The short answer would be yes, mostly.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this question because you did send me, of the million questions we've discussed, you did send me 5.
Yes.
And this was one of them.
What a disappointment.
Yeah.
Poorly prepared for this.
Yeah. I thought we were going to be in and out in 10 minutes. No.
Cross-state flight for 10 minutes of interview.
Absolutely. I was thinking about this and I was like, okay, well, what are scenarios where people have potentially low body fat and may struggle with, optimal or really efficient gains in lean mass. And I was thinking about it, and there's kind of a few factors that are pretty critical. For example, what is your kind of natural, comfortable walking around body fat? Because being someone who has been 7% body fat their whole adult life, not a lot of them, but like if you were just like always super, super thin.
I hate those people.
I know, right? But if that was your reality, that is physiologically a very different scenario than someone who cut from 21% body fat to 7% body fat. Like those are different starting positions.
Yes.
Another one where I think they're, as someone who has done like peer-reviewed bodybuilding research, sometimes we do have to reach for some analogous scenarios for any particular physiological effect. And so sometimes you will see some parallels in the bodybuilding prep literature and the anorexia nervosa literature. Not to diminish the severity of anorexia nervosa or trivialize it, but it is hard to find people who have dieted down to such extreme low body fats. However, that brings me to another factor to consider, which is how much fat-free mass do you have, right? Because the refeeding process looks very, very different for someone with anorexia nervosa who has extremely critically low fat-free mass versus someone who is a prepped bodybuilder who very diligently worked to maintain as much fat-free mass as they possibly could on the way down. So I think a lot of it...
How does that process differ, Eric?
So, for example, this has come up... if you think about refeeding studies in anorexia nervosa,
What is a refeeding study? Just to back up a little bit.
Well, refeeding, when we're talking about like in the clinical literature, if you are, for example, doing a study in patients who have pretty severe anorexia nervosa, one of the optimal outcomes is effectively refeeding, so increasing caloric intake and increasing body mass to get them back to a healthier body weight, right? And ultimately that happens for different reasons in the bodybuilding literature. You are not going to stay in contest shape for your 10-year bodybuilding
That was nobody's
career.
plan.
Right. Nobody wanted to. You're not going to. If you tried, it probably wouldn't work out, and it would suck if it somehow did, right? But in both cases, we see these folks who are very, very lean. They have a lot of dysregulation or adaptive regulation, depending on your perspective, of the endocrine system. They have a similar kind of endocrine profile of, all the way up at the hypothalamic level, suppression of these key hormone cascades.
Sex hormones, thyroid hormones, et cetera.
Absolutely. And so you might think, well, refeeding will probably look really similar in those cases. But with anorexia nervosa, if you go back to like the Forbes papers on P ratios, right? And you look at what happens with someone with severe anorexia nervosa and you start walking them up with caloric increases to a healthier body weight.
This is in a hospital setting.
Correct. Yeah.
They're not allowed to leave.
Yeah. Inpatient, folks who have been hospitalized for the treatment of their anorexia.
For essentially
nervosa.
psychiatric reasons.
Right. Yeah. So in these studies, they actually gain a pretty substantial amount of fat-free mass. Whereas when we look at the weight gain that occurs in bodybuilders post-competition, it is uniquely fatty weight. Like it is a tremendous amount of water weight and a tremendous amount of fat mass.
We're going to cut that out.
Yeah, exactly. But I think ultimately the main difference there is, even if you want to just theorize a little bit from an evolutionary perspective, evolutionary anthropology, that kind of thing, it is absolutely critical for folks who have significant muscle wasting and loss of organ tissue from sustained long-term anorexia nervosa. It's really critical for them for ambulatory reasons, for organ function reasons, to start adding back some of that critical fat-free mass that is like below safe levels.
Yes, like
right?
when your heart is smaller because parts of it were eaten away to keep your brain alive, when you get more protein and calories back, your heart's getting that food first. Your body fat is like the next tier. Body fat's by definition a reserve.
Yeah.
We're not ready to do reserve yet. Your main troop concentration has been hurt here.
Yeah. And I would not contend that bodybuilders are not losing any organ mass I would imagine that they certainly are, especially natural bodybuilders as they're kind of going through prep. But it's very, very different when you're talking about, I did an 18-week prep. How much of that organ tissue are you really chipping away versus someone who's been battling anorexia nervosa for years on end, right?
Yes.
It's just a completely different scenario. And so that's to me is why it's like, even if I take someone who's a shredded bodybuilder and a person with, a real battle with anorexia nervosa, and they're both starting with extremely minimal body fat. Maybe it's the exact same body fat percentage. I expect the composition of their weight regain, especially in the early phase, to be quite different because the empirical data tell us that it'll be quite different.
And it makes sense as well for evolutionary logic.
Yeah.
So if I'm a certain level of lean, as I come back up in body weight by eating more, I expect a fractionally higher regain of body fat than muscle than normal than if I just started moderately lean. Correct so far?
I would say, let me phrase it very carefully. If you are someone who has lost weight to get to that low body fat level, then we would expect your weight regain, especially in the early phase, will be relatively higher proportion of fat rather than fat-free mass. And going back to that dual intervention point model, if you got lean enough that you're below that intervention point, I would expect it to be even more exaggerated.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think you and I were actually involved in a debate. We used to do those things in the evidence-based community, right?
We did, yeah.
I found them fine, but the more I got experience doing them, I think a collaborative discussion where we share ideas together is way better than debate. It doesn't clickbait as well, but it's shit.
Yeah.
We used to talk a lot about, people used to think a lot of it was based on the Forbes data.
Yeah.
Which sucks to base entire models of ideas on just one data set, whatever.
Yeah.
That if you get really, really lean, your body's primed to gain muscle.
Yeah.
And that actually turned out basically just not to be true. It turned out to be arguably the reverse of true.
Yeah.
However, a compelling reason to me, and please feel free to correct me on this, in losing some body fat to potentiate muscle gain is that just if for no reason at all than aesthetic purposes, you just don't want to get to above 28% body fat and still have to tell people you bodybuild or whatever and then be like, oh, okay. So in order to create more runway for muscle gain and mass gain, it makes sense to cut some body fat off so that you can regain some combination of muscle. Because at a certain level, if you're starting moderately lean and you get pretty lean, in most cases, if you're resistance training, et cetera, you just don't lose a whole lot of muscle.
Yeah.
And then when you come back up, you gain some combination of muscle and fat that on the net balance, you get more muscle in the end. So runway creation to me is a compelling reason to do this. My question to you is, and of course we're speaking in nuances and relatives, et cetera, for males that compete in bodybuilding or are bodybuilding competitor adjacent, people involved in serious fitness. A lot of the people that watch this channel, they're trying to get jacked, shredded, lean, et cetera. Just on pure, and I know because you're one of the best scientists in this space, you're going to want to get real nuancy in particular, by all means, but just on vibe check alone, what sort of body fat level are we talking about below which you're like, why are you dieting this hard? And someone's like, runway. Dr. Mike said runway. At what level of body fat for males, and for females, just add 7%. That's what I always say.
Yeah.
Decent?
Yeah.
At what level below that would you, as a researcher and practitioner and pro bodybuilder, tell them like, you don't need to keep going this low, and that whole triangle shape under this bend is just a fucking waste of your time.
Yeah.
Where is roughly that number? Is it like 5%? Is it like 10%? Is it like 15? What's going on there?
I would say probably 12-ish.
12-ish.
Yeah. Basically, the reason I go 12-ish is I think if you are cutting for the purpose of, like you said, having that runway, being able to start that next bulking or massing phase with kind of a good starting point, you should not be starting that feeling like you just did a pretty arduous cut.
The fatigue alone, it puts you in a real weird spot for further gain.
Yeah. So we should be dieting, like I'm sure with Helms, he always talks about the idea of like a recovery diet. You should not be dieting to a point that you need any semblance of recovery from it, right? Yeah. And I would say for most people, they can cut down maybe into that 12-ish. Some people might be able to go all the way to 10% and say, I still feel great. Like I'm not feeling any of that like typical physiological diet fatigue. So in that kind of ballpark area.
So you should feel pretty good.
Yeah.
If you feel insane amounts of diet fatigue, exhausted, sleepless, etc., you're definitely not runway creating anymore. You just want to see more veins in your abs.
That's how I would probably operationalize it. Yeah.
Amazing. There is no avoiding hard training if you want to grow. But if you want to grow the most, your training needs to be hard and smart. RP Hypertrophy app will make sure you're progressing on track, monitoring and adjusting your workout at all times. So for all that work you're doing, you can be sure you're getting the best results. As far as health and as far as regain that's just all gonna be body fat, is there a level of body fat percent to where if you still feel good, you probably still shouldn't go to? Like if someone's like, look, honestly, I'm at 4% DEXA confirmed. Can I go to 3 to create more runway? I feel great. My training's great, whatever. Would you be like, look, man, all the literature we have on this is like, you're going to be 1 out of 100 outlier. I just wouldn't bet the farm on it. Or is it kind of like, if you feel good, you're still good to go? And is there anything, I know that it's unhealthy to put yourself under a crap ton of stress of getting down.
Yeah.
But for males who are not trying to proximally reproduce, is there anything unhealthy about being at 3% body fat or something like that?
I would say, if we're talking about being too lean for health, there's a really cool paper by John Speakman, who also was, did a lot of work with a dual intervention point model.
Second time you've referenced him. I love it.
Yeah. I'm actually working on a paper with him right now. Every time I email him, I get all nervous and I'm like, oh my God, I'm emailing John Speakman.
How do you think I feel with you right now?
Sure. Yeah. But John, he wrote a cool paper. I forget if he called it the clean cupboards hypothesis or the empty cupboards hypothesis, but it's basically an extended metaphor about when people are doing caloric restriction. In this case, people talk about caloric restriction as a life extension, longevity type tool.
What do you think about that really quick?
I think it's not practical for humans.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think the benefits that we would get from it in the interest of practicality are just maintained from being an active person with a fairly lowish body fat level.
Just don't be gigantic and ready to go. Right?
Yeah. I think it's more about attenuating sedentary lifestyle plus obesity.
Yep.
Yeah. But, and the protein restriction stuff, because that comes up a lot in the fitness world, really doesn't apply to humans. Sure. It's like all insect models. Yes. It doesn't even apply that well to rodents. And with humans, it totally falls flat.
Caner hebditis elegans, and that's about it.
Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, so clean cupboards or empty cupboards, it kind of talks about how, like, if you start with plenty of body fat reserves, you start dieting down, in this case for longevity, caloric restriction. At first, everything's great. Like your physiology is functioning great. You're kind of eating the food. The analogy is being like locked in a house with full cupboards. Mm-hmm. At first, you're like, oh, cool, I'll just eat what we got here, right? Mm-hmm. But at a certain point, you're going to start eating the house plants, right?
Right.
You run out of food in the cupboards, right? And you start to eat the stuff that's not supposed to be
You look at your pet like, he's kind of well built.
Yeah, exactly. And so the theory there is, which is totally intuitive, is at a certain point with caloric restriction and essentially weight loss secondary to caloric restriction, you start to make some difficult decisions. And like for a human, we might say, yeah, caloric restriction is great for longevity as long as you don't get it cut. Because like, where are you going to find the energy to heal a wound? Right? Like you just don't have it. Or, as long as you don't interact with any pathogen in your environment, because where's your immune response? It's going to be blunted.
That takes energy too. Huh?
Yeah. Like immune responses are quite energy demanding. And so the idea there is, with caloric restriction, at a certain point, we can look at some of these physiological responses and say, like, most people are going to feel like crap by the time they get there. But even if you don't, I can say, hey, there's some reasons that a person in terms of reproductive function, in terms of immune function, in terms of wound healing, all these types of things, you need to have enough energy around, right?
Yes.
And so if someone was coming to me and saying, I'm 4% body fat, I feel great. To be completely honest, I'd want to do two things. First of all, I'd want to get an endocrine workup, and I'd want to look at like, okay, you say you feel great. I want to know what your hypothalamus says. Like, I want to see your TSH levels, your whole thyroid cascade, your sex hormones. Because if you're like hypogonadal, low thyroid hormone, everything, like I'm gonna say like, now I want to refer you to like, and not being facetious, but like a psychologist, because I don't think you should be feeling good with this type of endocrine profile. And I'm wondering if perhaps you have convinced yourself you feel good, but there's something much deeper going on here.
Yeah. You have substantial body dysmorphia that needs addressing.
Right. It could be a cover where it's, I say I feel great because I really want to.
Yeah.
Right?
Or I feel great psychologically because I see abs and veins. And that's such an important thing to me for maybe not great reasons that like the physiology, I don't even know what it feels like to feel physiologically normal, because when I am physiologically normal at a higher body fat, I can't see my abs. And then psychologically, I'm so tilted off that I'm not even in touch with my physiological relation there.
Right. Yeah. So if in this hypothetical scenario, which again would be a major outlier, let's say someone's at 7% and they're like, I want to keep cutting because I feel great and then I'll bulk from there. I would want to look at, like, okay, if your, hormone panel is telling me, you're good to go, like still pumping out testosterone well within the normal range, which gives me an indication like, your reproductive function, everything's kind of going on all cylinders. I'd say, actually fine. Yeah. If you really want to, go for it. But usually you're going to be able to kind of look at those key indicators of, hey, we're at a point now where the body is responding to insufficient energy. And intuitively, to me, it makes sense that that's the point where your body is going to think long and hard about, let's go ahead and add some energy intensive muscle tissue to maintain.
Right.
More likely than not, that early phase, if you start pushing really far, is going to be regaining some fat, convincing your hypothalamus, hey, we're all good here. Go ahead and start making those hormones again, right? So I would think the endocrine profile would really tell me a lot there.
Amazing. One more meta question for you. Can you be too fat for optimal muscle gain? What does the theory predict? What does the data show? And do you see any limitations of the data that you're like, ooh, yeah, there's data, but I don't know? Or is the data fairly convincing in your view? And do we have a good idea, data-driven, direct idea, not even evidence-based, because evidence-based is a combination of data and all these other insights, just sheer data-driven. Is there any reason to suspect that you can be too fat to gain muscle optimally? And someone would be like, look, you're like, I want to get ultra jacked and I already lift and I already blah, 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 but I'm like kind of, over fat. And someone would be like, I think the first thing you should do is do like a 12-week fat loss phase, nothing crazy. And then we're going to come back up.
Yeah. This is a topic that you and I had a extremely contentious debate about. I mean, if it weren't virtual, we would have been throwing fists, I'm sure.
I was slamming my computer into the wall after.
But no, we had a discussion about this. And one of the things I find really fascinating about it in hindsight is that if you and I were in some kind of weird randomized controlled trial where we were both coaching the same kind of fake clients, we would have told them to do the same thing.
Yes.
But for completely different reasons, right? Or maybe even not. But we did have some degree, I believe, of like disagreement with regards to the empirical data in this area or how it kind of matches with intuitive theory, right? So I would say where this all started, going back to that Forbes P ratio thing. Forbes was a researcher who was interested in like underfeeding and overfeeding studies, weight loss and weight gain studies. What percentage of mass is gained as fat versus lean tissue or fat-free mass? And Forbes was able to fit a pretty compelling curve that fit a lot of different samples in very, very, very different populations. So ranging from people with anorexia nervosa to people who were like, had really, really high body fat levels and were subjected to like essentially like weird experimental fasting of like, we're going to do the most intensive weight loss study that's ever been done because we need you to lose 100 pounds immediately,
or you're going to die.
Right. Like it was just like, we are going full steam ahead and we'll see what we can do. What was interesting is it generally did show this idea that like when you're, for example, gaining weight, much more likely to regain a high percentage of fat-free mass if you're gaining weight from the perspective of someone with anorexia nervosa versus someone who is in a refeeding phase of a study, but you have like 45% body fat, right?
Right.
And that's extremely intuitive, makes all the sense in the world and holds up well. But in my view, the major limitation of that really nice curve that fits all these different populations so well is that none of them lift weights,
Right.
which is a huge, huge, huge deal because, you know, we can talk about what your body is inclined to do with some extra calories here and there. But what about when you crush it with heavy barbells all day? You're kind of telling your body what to do with it, right?
Yes.
Like there's this massive, powerful stimulus that is going to dictate in a major way where those calories are actually being allocated in terms of, you know, accretion of new mass. And I would acknowledge that I don't think that there is like the perfect data yet for like, hey, I'm sorry, your body fat's over this percentage. If you have any hopes of gaining fat-free mass, you necessarily are going to have to sign up for considerable fat gain to accommodate that. Like your ratio is going to be off. And so I kind of went back through some data and I was looking at, again, these are imperfect, indirect, but
As always.
yeah, but like, well, what happens when like absolutely shredded people regain weight? Looking at like the physique athletes, looking at like Minnesota starvation experiment.
Yep.
And you see pretty early stage fat regain. Like it's actually like the opposite of what the P ratio theory would suggest, especially with like, you know, even when you throw resistance training in there, right?
Yeah.
Now, another area I looked was like, well, what about like a really interesting kind of like imperfect real world experiment is like you get these 18-year-old kids onto campus for American football. Half of your team's like 8% body fat and they all look like a Greek god in terms of their physique. The other half is like 33% body fat. Yeah, they're like 300 pounds.
Yep.
And what's really unique about American football is they bring in these kids, let's say when they're 18, they're like 275 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
And the coach says, you are not going to smell that field until you gain 35 pounds,
Yep.
right? For like a defensive tackle.
Yep.
So it's this weird situation where you can look at like when we put these kids in literally the same environment with the same strength coach who may be altering the programs depending on position groups, like acknowledge that.
Sure.
But they're eating in the same cafeteria, interacting in the same environment. You know, do the linemen seem to have any kind of struggle gaining fat-free mass because of their excess adiposity at baseline? And in those populations, again, we actually tend to see the opposite, which is that they all gain pretty similar amounts of fat-free mass in the first year of that new training, new environment, et cetera, better resources. However, some of the linemen actually lose a little bit of fat.
They recomp.
Yeah, they actually recomp.
Negative P ratio.
Yeah, it's like you can't even calculate the P ratio because recomping like breaks all the math and you have to like, so like, and that brings me, you know, back in the day, I kind of put together like a little rough, like not perfect, participant level meta-analysis where like basically looked into studies that had individual level data from all these resistance training studies, some of them on lean college kids, some of them on individuals with obesity. The body fat range went from single digits all the way up to the 50s for the number of people that were included.
50s.
Yeah. And so fit a meta regression and said like, okay, in your resistance training study, who was making lean gains, who was gaining a lot of fat along with their muscle. And we had to calculate our own kind of metric that could actually work for recomping, right?
So P ratio's out.
Yeah.
It's negative. It's nonsense.
And so generally what we found was, again, in a sample where no one is like, where almost no one is shredded, right? People walking around campus, unlikely you're going to grab someone who's under 8% body fat, who's like, yeah, tell me to do whatever you want, right? If you find someone walking around campus that shredded, they have a very specific plan of what they're doing, right? So anyway, in that participant level meta regression, basically, everyone was gaining fairly similar amounts of fat-free mass in these pretty generic resistance training studies. The only difference was the higher your baseline body fat, the more likely that you were going to recomp, right?
Yeah.
So a better P ratio, and again, like you said, like a negative P ratio kind of. And then finally, something we've not discussed actually is in mass, either last month or this month, I forget which one, there's a new study in sumo wrestlers. I love studies in sumo wrestlers. Sumo is an incredible sport. Very, very cool. And my theory is that people love sport because we love special. And there is very few things to me more special than watching someone who weighs 430 pounds, powerful, moving like a ballerina. Like, it's
So scary as hell.
Oh, it's terrifying. Like, when I was in high school wrestling, our heavyweight guy ended up being a really good NFL lineman. And it was just amazing to watch him wrestle. You know, heavyweights look different when they wrestle. This guy wrestled like he weighed 140 pounds.
That's
like,
bad news.
Yeah.
Gable Steveson, do you know who that is?
Yeah, another
like
guy
wrestles like he weighs 140, but he weighs 260, and you're like, that's not fair.
And people who aren't tapped into wrestling, they can't really see the difference. But it's like, no, you don't move like that over 180, right? And he's 280.
Yes,
like, that's messed up.
Big problem.
Yeah. So sumo is incredible, but there's this new study just a month or two ago where they brought in these junior level sumo athletes who are like average age of about 15 or 16. And they tracked their body composition over a 6-month phase of training.
Whoa. This is in Japan.
Yeah.
Living in the sumo communities in the houses or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, really cool study. Of course, with any study, there's going to be methodological things that you can nitpick a little bit. So by no means perfect.
When I see a study, the conclusions of which I don't like, I'm just a fucking shark in the methods. But if I like the conclusions, I just read the first sentence and I'm like, this is revealed wisdom.
Yeah.
Am I a scientist?
Absolutely. And then like what I found was when you study like the general population or like college kids, people will say, bring me an athlete and we'll see. And then when you study athletes, they say every athlete's on steroids. Like, this study's irrelevant. Yeah. I was like, okay, I quit. But yeah, you'd think that like a D3 university is like the biggest doping hub in all of sport.
That's where it all happens, man.
But anyway, so these sumo athletes, again, 15, 16 years old on average. They're all like teenagers. 6 months of training, they gained 2 kilograms of body mass, and it was pure fat-free mass based on the methods used. Now, you could criticize it and say, well, they should have used a better method for body comp analysis. But I will also say it's tough to measure body comp in sumo athletes because DEXA is like, if you're wider than the scanning
in
range,
Japan,
it's
sure
tough.
as hell they don't have DEXAs for people that big.
Right, yeah.
In Missouri, they have a lot of upgraded DEXAs.
Yeah. So DEXAs for a long time, like if you were over like 250, it was, they'd be like, sorry.
I don't fit into a standard DEXA machine. They have to cut my body in half and infer the other side.
Right, yeah. So you do get that. If the only issue is width, then you can cut in half. But
are you saying I'm not tall enough to present a problem for a DEXA machine?
Well, I have done some work with like 7 foot tall basketball players, and we're just like, so if we imagine that your body ended just below the knee, this is
That's how lean this part is.
Yeah. But then like there's a weight limit too for DEXA machines. So with sumo, you run into the width and the weight limit.
Yep.
Whereas for you, width, good for you, problem, good problem to have. Weight limit, probably not, right? No big deal. So anyway, it can be tough with sumo, and then any type of equation-based method is, they don't make equations for sumo populations. But anyway, from what they could tell, these athletes gained about 2 kilograms over this 6-month period. And it was like they gained 2.1 kilograms of fat-free mass and lost 0.1 kilograms of fat, which is pretty great. So all of that is to say, I tend to be very empirical with how I kind of assess literature, and I always want to say, like, if this theory exists and it matters and, the effect is big enough to care about, then I should be able, hopefully, to find some of these pockets of the literature where it hasn't been studied directly, but I can still get these little glimpses of it. I can get these little hints.
That's all science is really just getting incrementally better hints at the truth.
Right.
We're never going to just see the whole universe as it is. Maybe when AI really takes off or something.
Yeah. So what I would say based on the indirect evidence when we're looking at football linemen and sumo athletes is like, man, if there is that number where it's like, I'm at too high a body fat to make lean gains from here, all I know based on those studies is that it's higher than 33% body fat.
Right.
And what I know is that I don't think I've ever talked to someone over 33% body fat that said like, hey, I need to bulk up. Like,
Too small.
Yeah. And if they are trying to bulk up from there, and they're probably a defensive lineman or a sumo athlete, and I say, well, just so you know, there's a possibility you might gain a little fat along the way. And they say, I don't care.
Whatever. It's more ballast.
There's not a lot of like professional defensive tackles with six packs or sumo athletes, right? So usually by the time it could theoretically maybe be an issue beyond the bounds of that literature, it's by definition not an issue.
Yeah.
But I would love to see direct evidence of what people often argue for, which is, hey, you're 22% body fat as a male or 25% body fat. I know you want to get more muscular. I believe if we get you down to 15 and then bulk, that will go better than if we bulk you from here and then do a cut after.
Yes.
And so that type of kind of like longitudinal look at it, to my knowledge, hasn't been done to a level that we could look and say, oh, definitely that can't work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find two compelling reasons to get, in some cases, somewhat leaner before bulking up. I'd like to tell them to you, and you can just tell me I'm wrong and stupid.
Yeah.
I'll begin to cry, but the crying does really well on YouTube.
Yeah.
Health probably is not optimized above 30% body fat in the vast majority of cases for males.
Yeah.
And so being healthy is kind of the underpinning of sport performance, almost like as a matter of principle.
Sure.
So if you get healthier substantially via blood work, there's a compelling case to get a little bit leaner so you have more health.
Yeah.
So far, so good?
Oh, yeah. And I like the 30% number because I think a lot of folks, especially 5 years ago in fitness, if you said, what's that body fat number where health really starts to
10%.
to nosedive? Yeah, like everyone was like, I guess you can get up to like 13%.
Yeah,
and it's like,
at 15,
dude,
you're fat.
not even in the ballpark. But yeah,
Right.
30% is a really like 28-30% around there.
Yep,
yeah.
yep. The other one to me, two more that I have. This one is not as big of a deal, but I think because it's bodybuilding, it matters. Self-assessed aesthetic preference. If I'm in the gym and I'm bulking and I got a little bit of shape going, I'm looking at my pump in the mirror and I'm like, more. If I look like block of cheese, man, I'm like, why am I even in here exactly? Does that pass your vibe check as like a decent, just human reason?
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the last one, and this is from experience for myself, because boy, had I gotten big. I got to a drug-free at 5'6", 270 pounds.
Yeah.
And I was not at 15% body fat, I'll put it mildly.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed at those levels, I suppose that this was probably at somewhere between 25 and 30% fat in my case. My repetition endurance within a set and my set-to-set recovery endurance completely went down the drain. And my mobility, especially for leg exercises and back exercises like bent rows, there's just shit in the way. And I can't even do the techniques properly anymore.
Yeah.
That is a concern, or what do you think?
That one's a little bit trickier because if I were to go to like peer-reviewed evidence for that, usually the context where we could get a little glimpse at that is they're bringing in people with high body fat at baseline who are not engaged in resistance training.
Yes.
And then they say, here, do some resistance training.
And everything just gets better.
Everything gets better, yeah. But I haven't seen it the opposite way where we take a resistance trained person and say, okay, we're going to bulk you up from 26% body fat to 33 and then see how your set to set or rep to rep performance changes. So yeah, I can't, that's kind of outside of the bounds of what we've got in terms of literature. But I will say absolutely, like that's completely intuitive. And I think an area where we've agreed all along on this particular topic has been, if I'm working with someone and they come to me and say, Eric, I know I could continue building muscle at a higher body fat percentage, but I'd like to get leaner before we do that because it'll make me feel better. It'll make my health numbers look better. It will make me more engaged in the process. I want to look a certain way. I'd be out of my mind to tell someone, no, that's stupid. We're bulking higher.
Yes.
The only time I would be off and be completely wrong would be if I'm a sports nutritionist and someone has come to me and said, Eric, the most important thing in the world for me is I want to be the best nose guard defensive tackle that ever played in the NFL. Problem is, I want to have a six-pack and I feel really uncomfortable over 220 pounds.
Refer to a psychiatrist.
That's not going to happen, man.
Right.
Like, I'm sorry.
Right.
Like, we can move you to linebacker.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, outside of those like fringe cases of extremely specialized sport, 100% agree that I would never push back against any of those.
I love that. So other than the time involved to cut down to a certain level, because in your earlier assessment, under 12% is when lots of people will start getting into the kind of diet fatigue that just doesn't make any sense anymore to get that runway built.
Yeah.
If I'm at 15 or 20% fat, it's both true to tell me, look, if you just keep going up, you'll gain tons of muscle, no problem. But it's also true to say, look, if you go down as low as 10 to 12%, as long as you still feel okay, you're not going to gain any less muscle coming out of that. And if you feel good, feel better, look self-assessment better, your health markers are better, and your endurance in the gym is better, and you can thus take the muscle closer to failure. So for example, high rep leg press. Your boy's failing when I'm at my fatter just because I can't breathe anymore.
Right.
My quads are like, dude, we're like at 5 RIR. I don't know what the hell is going on. So if that's all true for you, getting leaner is totally cool as long as you don't dip under like that 10 to 12%.
Sure.
And then so it's kind of all good things between that and 25 to 30 in your view?
Yeah. And I would say the biggest thing I would add to that, because I'm totally on board with all that. The last kind of caveat, some people might be picking up on what seems like a contradiction, where I've talked a little bit about weight regain research, where it's like, well, if you're cutting down and then regaining, a lot of times in that early phase, there's preferential regain of fat. We tend to see that when people we tend to see that in two particular circumstances, mostly, which also happens to be most of the weight gain literature.
Yes.
Which is annoying. But when people get very lean, below their lower intervention point, right? And that makes all the sense in the world. Another place where we see it that's a little less intuitive is when people have cut down and they didn't get shredded, but they lost a lot of fat-free mass on the way down. So if I'm working with someone like you described and they say, yeah, I'd like to get down more like 12, 13, 14 and bulk from there, as long as we're retaining fat-free mass on the way down, doing all the smart stuff you already do.
And not losing repetition strength.
Right, yeah.
Big notable way on the way down.
Yeah, we're cutting in a way where we're still performing well in the gym. We're not going super fast. We're taking our time with it in the broadest sense. Mm-hmm. You know, some people like to do like a hard week, an easier week, hard couple weeks, you know, whatever, in the aggregate.
Yes.
If we're taking our way on the way down, weight loss per month, whatever, maintaining that fat-free mass, eating plenty of protein, all that stuff, then we should still be in a great spot to regain lean mass from there. One of the challenges is if you're losing fat-free mass, and this is where like people who even start with very high body fat levels will have that preferential early fat regain. They're not doing resistance training on the way down. They're not eating enough protein. They're on these like 800 calorie liquid diets. They lose a bunch of fat-free mass. And for reasons we don't yet know, the loss of fat-free mass seems to really dramatically impact appetite on the way back up. So
it makes sense. If you're losing muscle, your body's like, we're in real deep shit.
Yeah. So the kind of scientific term for that is hyperphagia, which is just hunger plus. It's like you're really hungry.
It's like the iPhone Plus.
Yeah. It's like hyperphagia is when they're like, no, we're not talking about hunger. We're talking about hyperphagia. And so until you restore the fat-free mass that was lost, that kind of persists. And so a lot of people just have a tendency to overeat during that time frame.
The slingshot effect. Basically.
Exactly. And there's some great work by Abdul Dalou is the researcher's name. He's been publishing about it for like 30 years. And it's like every good paper in the area, he's like, hey guys, this still exists. Like someone else should study this too. But no, so that's kind of the key caveat is you want to make sure you're retaining that fat-free mass or muscle mass. But of course, you want to do that anyway on the way down. Like that's not new information.
Yeah, we're not addressing anyone here that's not like training on the way down during a fat loss phase.
Right.
I mean, maybe we are, but start training on the way down.
Yeah, and I do think that that's kind of a key thing is, well, you know, even people who are doing everything right, once they start getting below that lower intervention point, I mean, you've seen the case studies and the small little case series data on competitive bodybuilders, especially male bodybuilders. Even if you do everything right, when you get shredded, you lose fat-free mass, right?
Yes.
Like it's just part of what happens.
Drug-free, 100%.
Yeah, drug-free.
On drugs,
Yeah.
giant question marks abound.
People bring that, whenever I'm talking about weight regain, fat-free mass loss while dieting, metabolic adaptation, they're like, well, what if I put 4 drugs in the mix? And I'm like, dude, I'm going off the peer-reviewed literature. Like I can speculate, but yeah, based on the evidence, like that's what you need to do, Mike, is you need to create a research institute where it's just like
Drugs only.
we're not worried about IRBs and all this stuff. We're going to go ahead and figure this stuff out once and for all.
IRB, is that like a new compound we can give people that really messes them up?
Yeah.
Amazing. Eric, it has been absolutely an honor and a pleasure to chat with you. I learned like a metric fuck ton of stuff. You probably lost knowledge being around me as my stupidity just drains on other people. Where can people find you to learn more stuff?
Well, thanks for having me. And I didn't want to argue with you every time you gave me a compliment because I think that's really annoying in podcasts. But my broad thing is I reject all the compliments, but I do appreciate them.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at Trexler Fitness, and most of my work is at massresearchreview.com.
Excellent. Amazing. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in. And gee whiz, first run at a real super crazy long sit down. If you're asleep, wake up, damn it. See you guys next time.